We're still talking to you afterwards.
You should have given me a batch. And I went, I could use that. So where are you from? Oh, that's just
We'll be starting in about a minute as people coming in.
Huh? Yeah, we'll do it. I'll do it later. Yeah, because I'm running out of space on it. So I'm just going to try to film important stuff on it, or fun stuff, like if there's stuff happening on the monitor. We could have actually started. This distance. Maybe that shows up streaming. Yeah, we should make it
So in order to make the show up, did you have one camera on this thing?
No, what's causing that? We're being recorded. So
Well, I've heard that if it's ducted, it's a little bit more efficient.
Good morning. Welcome back to the Mars convention. I'm glad to see you this morning. Get to know a lot of you. I'm Bob Pace. I'm one of the volunteers for the Mars Society. And we have our first guest speaker this morning. He is Valda Domekovic. And he's going to talk the evolution of Mars and tell us some about himself, too.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It's hard. Sunday morning. I'm proud of you. That's the best way to start it. So, my name is Vladan Stamenkovic. I'm a research scientist at JPL, and I'm going to talk to you about two things today. I want to start again looking at the possibility of life on modern-day Mars and see what we scientifically know what could be possible, whether we're far off or maybe it might be closer to doing thought, and then show you some exploration tools how to address those questions. So I call my talk Modern-Day Mars Habitability and Subsurface Exploration. Now, my talk's going to be separated in two parts. In one part, we're going to do some science and look at some new things which are really exciting us about the possibility of extinct and also extant life on Mars. And then we'll jump into the technologies, how to address those questions. Now let's look at an example. And what I want to show you here, here means, I guess, around here, because I don't see it. And let me know if I scream louder, but I usually scream loud. Here we go. The interesting thing when I think about Mars is, if you go look at Mars, there's been right now a heat wave in Europe, and I've read a lot of newspapers writing in Europe. Europe is becoming like Mars, which shows, I guess, the level of not knowing what Mars is like. I know it's different over here, but we know it's a desert. It's very dry, but it's a very cold planet. We see average temperatures are between 140 and 300 Kelvin. Don't ask me what this is in Fahrenheit. I do not know, but it is very cold. And what's really important is as well that the pressure is very low. It's about 6 millibar, a factor of up to 100 lower than the Earth. And the atmosphere has very little oxygen, about 0.145%. Remember, our planet has about a 1 bar atmosphere, 20% oxygen, much more than on Mars. However, we've discovered something in the last few years that's really exciting. We've discovered amounts of rocks that contain manganese oxides. Now, that's really exciting for one reason. See, iron is really cheap. When there's oxygen, iron does let's go. You build iron oxides very easily. You need very small quantities. Manganese is very difficult. It needs a lot of oxygen in a dissolved liquid state. So you need to have oxygen in dissolved waters, and then a lot of it actually. And then manganese will say okay, let's bind together and make manganese oxides. Now, the interesting thing is when we discovered that, people started wondering, what does it mean? These are old rocks, so we most likely indicate something far in the past, or it was maybe the alteration occurring over time. What does it mean? Was it more oxygen on Mars? Maybe because water was photodissociated and hydrogen escaped and oxygen accumulated. What's going on? That's really interesting because, when we think about the Earth, we see manganese oxides only after the so-called Great Oxygenation event, which occurred about 2.5 to 4 billion years ago, where we had almost no oxygen, and then suddenly a spike of oxygen rising to large levels. And only then do we really see manganese oxides. So we're talking really about a lot of oxygen needed for that. And that was a big puzzle. Now, what we did is we said does it maybe infer something about the potential habitability of Mars or modern Mars? And to answer that, we said a very simple question. That's explained in this diagram, and we're going to look at it in a moment. Now imagine the first question. Can there be liquid, any kind of liquid on the Martian surface or shallow subsurface? Now, we've been debating this thing for a long time. For pure water, it's very difficult. Because the pressure is very close to the triple point where it becomes very unstable. In the shallow subsurface, if you have a little bit of soil, it can be stabilized to some degree. But what's really important is, because the temperatures are so low, you really need to somehow find some form of brides, which means water and salt mixed with each other, that help you lower the freezing point of that brine. Now, some salts, when you add some salts to water, you can very much suppress the freezing point. You see this always in the winter when you drive around, not in LA, but if you go to the East Coast, or you have to go to the East Coast like in January, February, you see all the slurry streets with salts in there that help to prevent the ice from freezing. That's the important part. Now, what we're showing in this diagram here is, if you look at different salts, and they're shown in different colors. Example, you take just normal table salt, NaCl, or you take example exotic salts, which are more common in Mars than on the Earth, like perchlorates. Calcium perchlorates, this is the CaCO2, CO4, and the magnesium perchlorates, which are just the second and the third one. Sorry, I'll have to bend over to see that image myself. We can ask ourselves the question, if we have such a brine, how much oxygen in equilibrium with today's atmosphere could be dissolved in those brines. And what we can do is we can generate a chemical model that calculates that. And that's what we've done here. And what is interesting is the following. Let's have a look now at the calcium perchlorate, which is the second one from above. It's got like a pink color. You see, this here shown you as a function of temperature, the concentration of oxygen you would get today in that brine, in equilibrium with the atmosphere. We're starting at 0 degrees Celsius, which is 273 K. And you now follow the pink line. You see it goes a bit down, and then it starts to increase. So you start at lower temperature, because when you are at very low temperature, it's still liquid. The gas wants to stay actually in the liquid and not in the atmosphere. It goes into the liquid and stays there. So we start to have larger concentrations of oxygen. And if you go down, follow that pink curve to about 200 Kelvin, you'll see you reach levels of 2 to -4 mole per cubic meter, which is quite a large concentration of oxygen. Now something additional comes in. You see, after I've made the line dotted, not solid anymore. Dotted means always, we scientists do dotted, we were like, oh, something weird's happening, but it's possible, very likely, but there's a possibility, maybe not. Experiments have shown one thing. They've shown that calcium perchlorates and other brines can very effectively supercool for long periods of time. Even when they're mixed with regolith, that's analogous to example, Mars, even when they're mixed with other salts, they still remain for very long time scales, just liquid. And this has to do with that perchlorate ion. It's a very aggressive ion that's disturbing actually nucleation freezing. So experiments have shown that for perchlorates, it can remain in a super cold state down to 140 Kelvin. And if you then say that, okay, let's do that. Let's calculate then the solubility in that liquid. You continue that pink line in the dotted pink line, and you get even larger values of oxygen solubility. So what we learn here is for many brines that can exist on Mars today, in equilibrium with the atmosphere, where there's only little oxygen, you can actually dissolve large quantities of oxygen. Now, how large and how meaningful is that? Let's look at this next image. Now let's take this data and say, well, let's look at Mars. Let's take the temperature variations we have in Mars between 140 K and 300 K approximately. Take average pressure, and let's calculate the solubility range that will be possible on modern-day Mars for different brines. And again, the colors here represent the range for different brines. The important thing here to see is there's two cases. One is the BE, which means no supercooling. We just say like supercooling is too crazy, let's forget about it. And then there's one without the CSC, and then BE is with supercooling. We say, well, supercooling, we see the experiments, it works, so let's trust it. But what's really important is all this, both cases where we see the range of the oxygen solubilities. In the last figure, you see it in relation to what we know from the Earth. Microbes need about 10 to -6 mole per cubic meter for not just breathing, but for full respiration and reproduction. So if they have more than 10 to -6 mole per cubic meter of oxygen dissolved in water, they're happily living. And every brine that we simulated for current Martian conditions has at least 1 to 2 orders of magnitude, even in the worst case, more oxygen dissolved in them than needed for microbes. And we're talking about simple microbes, like E. coli breathing oxygen. We're not talking about something crazy, weird guy there. It's like just something really that is everywhere around us. Now, what's really interesting as well is, if you look at the supercooling stage, so the BE case, the first one, where we account for supercooling, the concentrations are large enough that even cross the threshold for sponges to breathe. And sponges are the simplest animals on this planet. So what this shows us, and that's the amazing thing, for decades, people never dared to think that Mars might have the possibilities of having environments that have large oxygen concentrations. It was just not a question. When we thought also about habitability or life, aerobic metabolism was simply not considered because there's little oxygen in the Martian atmosphere. But when you start thinking that bugs, they need actually oxygen dissolved, and you do the calculations step by step according to the laws of physics, you see, wow, actually Mars is a really intriguing place for aerobic respiration today. And the cool thing is, these results help you as well understand these manganese oxides maybe. They don't mean that there's much more oxygen in the Martian atmosphere. It just means there's brines out there, which means there's liquids actually not far away from the surface, and those liquids can dissolve a lot of oxygen, enough for life to breathe. Now we can do the next step. We can say, okay, let's go to today's Mars. We'll make climate models. We'll look at the average temperature, average pressure as an example. Here are maps of current Mars, climate models, GCM, showing average temperature, average pressure. Let's take this and combine this with the solubility results, because solubilities depend on temperature and pressure. That means if we know what the temperature and pressure on a spot are, we can compute also the solubility of that spot. And when we do that, we get cool stuff. We get maps that show us how the solubility of oxygen can vary on the Martian surface today. Again, two figures. The upper one is with supercooling, we allow for the possibility. The lower one is no supercooling, we ignore the possibility. But what's important, we start to understand where on Mars we can have a larger potential for aerobic respiration today for both cases. And they're mostly driven by lower temperature and high pressure regions. Next thing we can do, we can say, well, cool, we know about nowadays Mars, but Mars, but let's learn something about time, about evolution. And the important thing here is we can say, well, we know that Mars obliquity, so tilt of the axis tilt, is actually changing over time. And it's been strongly changing over time. And if it changes, the climate is affected. And so I show you example here, two pressure temperature plots for Mars on average, annual averages for different obliquities. And now what we can say is, well, let's compute then how the oxygen solubility changes the function of obliquity. And this is, let's look just at the upper pink curve, which shows you the maximum possible value on Mars of oxygen solubility. For low obliquities, it's very large. For higher obliquities, it becomes much smaller. And the variation is by orders of magnitude. And what this shows you is that when you go to larger obliquities, the poles start turning towards the sun, start heating up, and the cooler regions start to become warmer and dissolve less oxygen. But what's really cool is in the next step, we can just say, well, now we know how actual solubility changes with obliquity. Do we know how obliquity changes as a function of time? We do to some degree. So we can take a model how obliquity changed in the past and might in the future, back to 20 million years, and in the future up to about 10 million years. And this allows us to understand then how the obliquity impacts the solubility as a function of time, and therefore how the solubility of oxygen is varied as a function of time. And again here, the upper curve actually shows the maximum value possible, and the lower curve shows the average. And what you see over here, that's the interesting thing, if you go back, today is zero, you go back to minus 5 million years, we allow in an epoch where there's large oxygen solubility is possible. If you go the preceding 50 million years, 5 million years, and back to 20 million years in the past, then they're about 200 to 1,000 times lower. So what we see is climate change driven oxygen solubility and aerobic potential on Mars as a function of time. And that is the cool thing. We start to understand that Mars has today, and also in its past, recent past, the potential of enabling actually environments that have enough oxygen to be resources for aerobic organisms, or maybe to some degree even habitats. And we know where it could be and how they evolved as a function of time. Now, let me see what time it is. Oh, it's good timing, perfect. So the first part of the message is, wow, Mars is actually much more interesting for extant life to be able to fall. But it's not for life as we fall, though. It's for a different kind of life. Life that's actually closer to us than we fall. We've been looking a lot for a very alien, weird kind of life that, doesn't do any aerobic respiration, and maybe it's more similar to that we actually fall. And Mars today is becoming more and more interesting for those questions. Now, but how do we now go to Mars and explore this? One thing is making a model and comparing the data. Second thing is really going to these places and checking them out. Well, first, those results are shown right now are valid in brines. Those brines are stable mostly in the subsurface. They're stable in the shallow subsurface, but also in the deeper subsurface. Example, if the results of liquid water below the South Polar automated deposit were to be correct, then we would have the potential in those deep environments to have a lot of oxygen because of the low temperature, and also the larger amount of possibly perchlorate if there is an exchange with the atmosphere or there is radiolytic production of oxygen. So what we have to do now is we have to say, like, well, can we explore in those subsurface regions? And can we finally develop the technologies and the strategies, especially because the technologies are already there many times, to finally go back to Mars and look at the really exciting zone, which is not just a micrometer below the surface, but it's actually deeper. Can we finally change the dogma and not just, do great science on the surface, but go to the next step, which will allow us to really answer the questions that the Vikings tried to answer more than 45 years ago. And that's why the subsurface is so exciting. And that's shown here with this image. Anything that's related to liquid water or brines or even ices, anything that's related to life, and of course in the future also the resources, happens in the subsurface, shallow to deep. If you're thinking about the water stability of your water, theoretically that's somewhere in the order of kilometers actually. If we have brines, we can bring it closer to the surface. But we don't really know. We don't really know whether really water is there. We have indications, but we haven't really explored it yet. Enough. But another thing is, if you're looking at what we know so far from the subsurface, these are some results, some pictures from NSL taking drill samples at the 1 to 2 inches. Now, the amazing thing I love about these pictures, when you look at the surface, the sort of sand that's right above it, it's all the same color everywhere. So these samples have been taken in different spots, kilometers away. But you just go 1 to 2 inches below the surface, and the color is different. Now, we scientists get really excited about colors. And the reason why is colors indicate usually the oxidation state. Is it reducing? Is it oxidizing? And that's what life thrives upon. It's redox gradients. Where do we have oxidizing agents? Where do we have reducing agents? And we don't see that when we look at the surface because it's the same stuff. It's immediately oxidized. But beneath that surface lies a world full of wonders which we haven't really explored yet, which is relevant and critical if we are really keen on understanding the potential of life. Now, we have indications that the subsurface might be very interesting. I've just shown you some results. This is my virtual laser pointer right there. On the right side is my map for oxygen solubility, indicating that the shallow subsurface, near surface might be very interesting for aerobic respiration. We had Chris Webster also from JPL just published his papers a few months ago about methane seasonal variations, which is really interesting, indicating either volatile sources, clathrate, or maybe even some questions related to life. We've had just now Mars's paper debating and claiming that might be possibility of liquid, briny, likely perchlorate waters, 1.5 kilometers. That's 1 mile. I'm getting a little bit, and that's how much in feet. But below the South Polar deposits, we are seeing also RSLs, which are still to be debated whether they're really actually indicating water, but that's something up in the air. But we see some trends, some questions that we paint and indicate that water might play a game in the shallow to deep subsurface. Now, also next to just understanding questions related to life and water, I know a lot of people here are excited about human exploration, and it's very simple. Unless we really figure out what the water inventory, icy and liquid, and also methane and the subsurface is about, any mission to Mars will be a horrible Big Brother TV show where we're just going to watch people die. We have to understand questions about where do you get water, where is it poisonous, and we can answer those questions, but we must do that. Otherwise, any human mission is just a suicidal mission. On the second hand as well is, us scientists who are driven by understanding life on Mars, we want to understand that question much better before we send humans. So we have to find and explore the Martian subsurface as soon as possible to enable humans, but also to answer the biggest question driving mankind. That's, are we alone or not? And for this, I want to just show you quickly, we've got some time left here. Perfect. I want to show quickly what we're doing at JPL to address this question. We're starting to explore and build up a program called MarsX, which stands for Mars Subsurface Exploration. I'm really all about acronyms. It's the most important thing I think in science at all. And you'll see more. So MarsX is composed of 2 technologies that we're investigating and developing at JPL in the next few years. One is called THOR, TH2OR, which stands for Transmissive H2O Reconnaissance. And The other one is Asgard, which is a longer abbreviation for Arid Subsurface Great Access and Research Drill. And the important thing is what we want to do is we want to go back to to the daring claims of the Vikings who went out there to eventually look for some bugs. Were the only mission to land on Mars that really looked for life, or metabolic activity to be precise. And we thought, the Vikings haven't completed their mission, and in order to complete them, we're gonna go back to Thor. And what Thor's gonna do, we're gonna talk in a second, is look where liquid water is and look what its salinity and chemistry is. And Asgard is a deep drill to access these zones. And it culminates in Asgard because ultimately the Vikings only will find peace once they complete the mission, and then they can go to Asgard and to Valhalla and drink mad and be happy and be like done forever and like let us go now and bother us anymore. So I want to talk a little bit quickly now about the Thor concept, which is the one that I'm leading at JPL, most involved with. It's the transmissive H2O reconnaissance. And what we really want to do is we want to demonstrate that we can develop small, 5 kilogram units, very low power, 10 watts. They can actually be put down on the Martian surface and can tell you whether there's liquid water anywhere down to about 5 to 10 kilometers, and then tell you also the salinity of the water and therefore infer directly the chemistry. Now, the cool thing is we can do amazing sites with very small gadgets. And the principle we're doing over here and showing this image is just we're using simply electric conductivity. If there is any electric conductive object in the subsurface, and water, for example, liquid water is a very good electric conductor, if it has a little bit of salt, just a little bit, a hash of salt, and every water has a hash of salt, a little bit of salt. What happens is, if you put some kind of conducting system on the surface, a wire or something else, you put a current through, you switch a current off, it generates a variable magnetic field. Faraday's law of induction says that variable field will induce currents in conductors, example, water's down there, and there we create new variable magnetic fields that go into the surface, which we can detect. And that allows us to find those gadgets. That's different to radar, because radar is sending out a wave, and it's looking at the wave propagation, and the wave interacts with the rock, and that's being reflected and diffused back. And here we're actually triggering, and I'm trying to understand electric conductivity. That's what we're doing. Now, the cool thing is, by looking at potential challenges, these kind of gadgets exist that are most common tool to look for water actually on the Earth. But they're very heavy. They're about 100 kilograms, they're about 50 to 100 watts. They're very complicated. They take days to just look at one data point. They're always human-tended. There's a lot of people involved in them. Mars also, is a special environment where there might be actually false positives like magnetite and so on, which we might have to take out. And also, this has never been flown on any planetary mission. It's only on the Earth. So what we want to figure out, and what's great, Mars is actually the ideal place to do these kind of things. And I'm showing this actually here because Mars is cold and predominantly dry. The contrast between dry and wet at this low temperature is much larger, orders of magnitude. Therefore, for the Mars conditions, we can actually penetrate with much smaller power, much deeper, which is the huge advantage. And by doing so, we'll be allowing ourselves to actually do amazing small missions that will be able to look if there is liquid water on Mars and infer its salinity and therefore also its chemistry to some degree. But what I find also really wonderful is we're developing very small tools, very simple tools that are very cheap, hopefully when we finalize them, that we can actually share with the world. And one of the biggest problems of the world is actually water availability, also in California. And the problem is mostly because large companies are interested in large water sources, not in the small ones. Now, if you have a small gadget, that costs like $50 and you give it to a village and they can just say like, well, we found a lot of water at this depth. And now comes the point that's not too saline, because it's too saline, it doesn't work with them. The money needed to desalinate is too large. So it's drinkable, but it's quality that can give our village 5 years of water. That's great. It's great for them, not for our company, but they can live. And that's something what I love, because we can utilize this technology not just to bring us to Mars and to understand the biggest question, if there's water on Mars and there's life on Mars, but it can help our brothers and sisters on this planet who need it the most to actually make it. And also the technology can be utilized later on for exploring for exploring Europa, for exploring also the moon, for understanding other questions related to ice, water, and structures. Now, I will not talk anymore, my time is out of the way, about Asgard. I'm happy to talk about it later on. What I want to really give you as a message over here is the following. when we think about Mars, and I have a good friend of mine said to JP, said Mars is not a small Earth, it's a different planet. And you have to think differently. And that's what we're seeing here. But looking, for example, at the aerobic potential of Mars, we see great surprises, which we never expected, because we always think terrestrial, think from our perspective. But suddenly we see something emerging, aerobic potential. We see that life might have actually more chance on Mars today than we ever thought. And that's calling for exploration. We also see that we need to explore the Martian subsurface if we want to really answer those questions. We got to push for that. We can't go on with the status quo forever. It's just not interesting enough anymore, and it's not actually helping to answer the question. If we want to make the money we put in useful, we got to ask different questions and use different technologies to answer those, and specifically look in a different domain, which is the Martian subsurface. We do have the tech. We're there. We're developing it. Most of it is ready. Chris Sack, my friend and colleague over there, is going to talk later on as well about drilling technologies, which he's been doing for decades and decades. No, he's not that old. He's still young. and it's there. We just have to literally, the only thing we're going to do is dare and do it. And to give you that, if we manage to do that, well, that's the only way we can finally answer these big questions. And here, in honor of a great musician who posed this question a long time ago, is there life on Mars? We can answer that. We just have to go there with the right tech. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions?
So Tom Gold, well-known geophysicist, I'm here to go. You're smiling now. I'm going to ask you.
That one may not be. Yeah, here we go. It's this one.
So while we're waiting for this, I want to just highlight at the last slide here. If you have any questions, please feel free to write me. We also have a HU session this year called the New Mars Underground, focusing on Mars subsurface exploration and for answering these questions. And we're building, starting that for the JPL community that really wants to go and explore the Martian subsurface and get cool stuff. Yes, please.
Okay, so you know that in the 1980s, Tom Gold, the famous geophysicist, demonstrated the presence of a deep hot biosphere under a igneous old crater formation in Sweden. He's expected to be able to, and he got bored done, and they brought up this material that was Carrigan, and it had life associated with it that nobody expected to find except him. You expect to be able to, with your detection instruments, detect something that deep or that active?
Well, let's say it this way. Know the paper, love it. I do have to say, the interpretation, whether that Carrigan's detector is really part of abiotic or non-process is still to be debated. But I fully support the messages that he was trying to transmit, which is the potential of a deep biosphere, which is fully unexplored. And there's a great bunch of scientists, great team all over the world that's really addressing these questions. We are trying to explore the deep biosphere and how much life can actually originate in the deep biosphere. Maybe it doesn't even need the surface. For Mars, I have to tell this one, we just don't know. We really do not know. Many times I tell myself, if you have a very effective isolating and low resource biosphere that's in the subsurface, if it's very well utilizing resources, you don't really see many signs above that habitable zone. You don't see them on the surface. So we can do the same also on Mars. Now, question: can we address these things? Yes, we can. I think good old times. Yes, we can. I think we can access these domains technologically, and we can sample, and we can make the analysis we need to do to infer its redox potential, its chemistry, its metabolic potential, and also maybe the existence of biomolecules, and also maybe metabolic activity. So yeah, we can do that.
So there was something at the surface that indicated it was there, which was an old crater formation.
Yeah, well, that was allowing you to see the methane seeping out and see where it is, which brings us to the images of methane seasonal variation I've put in. Of course, that is something which I find might be interesting indicator to see as well. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Do I choose or?
Okay, speculation and personal opinion. In the heyday of Mars, when they had the big ocean in the northern hemisphere, and more temperate, climate, how far did life advance from just single cell organisms?
Well, see, I have to say, like, I hope this was the case in Mars. I think scientifically it's hard to say that there really was there. There's a lot of discussion about the much colder Mars. You see, even the results we have now, we should not always think, Earth-like, humid, a lot of oceans is the ideal thing. But what I'm showing you example is even with low temperatures, you can have conditions which might be actually helpful for life, different kind of life. But so we don't need to have, very warm past and ocean to have life. Now, leaving that apart, let's say life maybe evolved easier in the past, it was maybe warmer. We don't know. No, I direct a lot of people to origins of life, great scientists, beautiful people. And I have to say it's impossible, I think, right now to quantify that because we don't understand we can quantify processes related to the origin and evolution of life well. But if you're looking at the Earth, once there was enough oxygen, we see a huge acidification and huge quick change of very simple organisms to very complex organisms. So oxygen might be indeed linked to actually speeding up evolution, giving more potential for actually different kind of organisms. So that might be having, especially aerobic environments, might be an interesting trigger to start asking the question, does it help to boost evolution?
Yeah. Have you or anyone else done, or are there any plans for simulations of making these solutions and seeing how well bacteria or other microorganisms thrive in them?
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely, absolutely. We still don't have results yet to say that we're going to be doing our tests and we'll continue this in 1 year to really do the experiments, whether the grinds are stable, how the stability changes, and then putting different kinds of bugs in there and microbes and seeing how the activity and survivability changes for variable concentrations. And that's really exciting. Specifically, we're discovering more and more how example, so perchlorates are not very common in the Earth for a major reason. They get quickly washed away. We have Earth is really the water time scales are very low here. Things go fast, which is good for us. So when we create mess, we can get rid of it quicker, which we do. On Mars, it's much slower. So perchlorates occur and can be formed in oxidizing environments. There's still some degree of uncertainty to that, but in oxidizing environments where there's low water, but water has to be there, but it's slowly flowing, and that's Mars. So perchlorates can coolate over there, and they create this really different chemistry we don't really see on the Earth naturally. But, and that's now thanks to us humans, we see this kind of chemistry occurring in a lot of waste sites where we just throw stuff out, which is, perchlorates are often a waste product of many plants. And in these waste sites, we see now interesting biochemistry occurring. We see organisms thriving, doing weird oxidation and reduction sometimes of perchlorates and oxygen, giving it forth and back. We see that is actually occurring, but we haven't really explored yet because it's not naturally happening in the Earth that much. We just start. So kind of funny, Mars and waste sites on the Earth come together.
Right. One last question over here.
Over here, 45 degrees to your right. So on that notion, how do we know how deep the toxic perchlorates go, or do we need Mars X to tell us?
Well, we don't know. See this whole thing with so far, since you said toxic, maybe the toxic Mars for sure. Maybe they're not toxic on Mars. We don't know. Right now, we have the best evidence of perchlorates was really Phoenix. Some years ago already now, when they digged in the scoop and they found some evidence of magnesium and calcium perchlorates. We have some evidence from orbiters, but from orbiters, really, you see literally a micro. We see like what's right there reflecting, what's right there emitting, and that's just the outermost layer. So we don't know. We really don't know. That's exactly. I have to really say it's. I find it always, when you talk about the Martian subsurface, I'm very serious when I say that is another planet than we have explored in the last 45 years. Not. That's the best analogy we can make. We literally have another planet in the solar system that we've never looked at. And that's the only planet that is in near reach where we can really answer the questions of extinct and extant life. So it's right there. Let's go and get it.
Again, thank you. That concludes resolution of Mars by Habitability.
Vlada Stamenkovic.
We have the next speaker that's going to be coming up here, and I believe Robert would like to introduce him. I'm told that he's here. John, are you around? Yeah.
Is John Mankins here?
Okay.
So John Mankins is an elusive person. Okay, well, I'll introduce him anyway. Okay, some of you saw John Mankins. I debated him on Thursday evening about the merit of the lunar orbit gateway, and we disagreed on that. He thinks it's a good idea. I think it's a really bad idea. But putting that aside, I've known John Mankins for about 30 years, and for 20 of those or so, he was the head of the Advanced Programs Directorate at NASA, and attempted to get developed a whole range of advanced technologies, including some that I was very interested in, notably in situ resource utilization, and also nuclear, space nuclear power, space nuclear thermal rockets, some other stuff. But he was actually involved in a whole range of things beyond those that were my concerns. One area that he has considerable expertise in, which I think is a very important area, is power beaming. That is transmitting electrical power, wireless beams. We see this a little bit now with wireless devices and things, but we're talking about transmitting substantial amounts of power. Of course, the classic view of this, which John has been a supporter of, is the, or a version of, I should say, his own, he has a certain innovative idea on how to do it, is the O'Neill vision, where you would build solar power satellites and transmit electricity down to Earth for consumer applications. Of course, Gerard O'Neill had the idea of putting these satellites in geosynchronous orbit. One idea I saw that John had was greatly simplifying, in certain respects anyway, the engineering by putting these satellites in low Earth orbit and having a large constellation of them, and that would reduce the distance that the power had to be transmitted by about a factor of 100, which is useful. What else can I say about John Mankins? So after leaving or retiring from NASA, he started his own company, Artemis Innovations, to pursue advanced space technologies. Has anyone found John Mankins, Carrie?
But he did come in this morning to check in with his flash drive.
All right. Well, in that case, if the previous speaker would like to come up and answer a few more questions.
More questions.
All right. Who has additional questions for Vlad?
Okay, over here, Kirk.
Since you found potential for subsurface geology,
subsurface geology that is even friendlier to kind of oxidizing life that we have on Earth, what kind of risk does that pose for forage contamination, if you said humans?
You know, when I first started doing these things, I think my friends who were planetary protection, their reaction was like, yes, oh no, You see, I think inevitably, whatever we do with Mars, we have to go back to the sterilization labs we've done for the Vikings, which is the highest one on the record. Once we do that, we should be able to go and explore these things. I really feel, and I think right now the planet protection strategy is changing in NASA towards a much better. It's a really great planet protection officers who are doing, I think, leading us in the right direction to make it easier. It's my hope, because we should make it easier. So, well, that's to be decided. I mean, we really, we can think and believe a lot. We just don't know anything, really. That's what I mean. Like, we literally have to start exploring, looking what a liquid water is, what salinity is, start drilling, to be able to say what is really there. If there's not very little, then we'll find strategies around it. If there's much more, then we have to have better strategies around it. But right now, it's just it's hot air, I think. We gotta first have data.
Another question?
So, we're already thinking forward to figuring out how we can make Mars more Earth-like, if not terraform it, right? And so we are trying to reproduce the evolution of the Earth, as it will. What's your view of the progression from anaerobic to aerobic life forms? You talked about aerobic, but fermentation forms of energy production are probably predominant there on Mars now.
Well, that's, a likely predominant. That's a good question. I wonder. I thought that too, But the thing is, as we said, oxygen, if you have enough of it, you'd say it's energetically the best thing to go with. The early Earth. So there's a good question. If you look at the early Earth before the Great Oxygenation Event and compare it to these solubilities we have on Mars and those brines, these ones are bigger than on the early Earth. So the reason why maybe on the early Earth we didn't have so quickly aerobic respiration is because there was no oxygen. There's more in dissolved on Mars. So I would question whether that hypothesis we have lost ever, that Mars is anaerobic, and that's the most likely metabolism, if that's really valid. I don't know. I know where you're coming from, but I really don't know anymore. Terraforming, I'm of course very excited about it. I'm also thinking, that's something. A friend and colleague who's been working in the Californian Department for Environmental Management, and she showed me a really beautiful work that showed how in California, just the Californian Valley, to make it from what it was kind of like all land into a fertile ground to produce all our vegetables, it took about 100 years of controlled manipulation to desalinate it, to get salts out. So I'm very excited about Terraform, and that's a dream. But it will take a lot of time, and that's what we will have to do.
Can you imagine a simulation or a laboratory simulation or a prototype that might help us understand that?
Oh yeah, I think it's always good to first go to laboratories, we kill less. Absolutely.
Thanks for that, no animals harmed in this movie.
Okay, any other questions? And by the way, is Rand in here? Rand Super? You'll be up next.
You mentioned to access possible deep underwater lakes, a drill that would be able to drill up to 10 kilometers down, and you mentioned as a goal of mass of 100 kilograms. Now on Europa, the concepts I've seen involve a heated probe that sort of gently melts its way through the ice and then sinks down, unspooling a cable behind it. In Mars, you presumably would have to deal maybe with rock. What would you envision the mechanism to be to get that deep down and be able to do it with such a small mass in total?
So can say a few things about it. Can't share everything right now about it. But the important thing is two of the major things is if you find the right places, let's say this way, where you have strong enough rock in the right geological configuration that your failure of the rock is strong enough. So it's small enough so you can fail rock easily to your bedrock, strong bedrock. You can have much less mass if you have very thin drill holes. So interesting when you look at the drill hole thickness, it's very critical to determining the stability of the hole through bedrock. And you can find a sweet spot where you have a very small drill, it's very stable, and it's not for sampling, scientific sampling, not for exploration, for exploitation, but for sampling, it's fully enough, where you can very effectively drill fast, specifically if you use the CO2 atmosphere as a resource for energy, but also as you're drilling fluid. Because the viscosity properties are just really ideal on Mars, both in low temperatures, CO2 being a liquid, it is when it's pressurized, but having a lower viscosity than water by a factor of 10, which makes it energetically more feasible. And these are some of the tricks that allow you to go actually to very low mass and just, within 1 Earth year, go deep.
Thank you, Greg, for introducing us.
John Mackey's shown up yet? No. Okay, so in case he does show up, I'd like to try to save some time for him by starting the next speaker early, because Rand Sindor is here. Rand is, as he puts it, a recovering aerospace engineer. But he has been a pioneer in pushing for the private road to space, the entrepreneurial road to space. His point has been more than the technical form, it is, if you will, the organizational and political form in which space exploration and development occurs that will be enabling or disabling. So without further ado, Rand Sindor.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning. This talk is a little bit of a plug. This talk is partly based on part of a very long essay that's about to be published in the New Atlantis that I wrote. And I believe that Bob has a piece in that issue as well. So it's going to be kind of a sort of space issue. So the August issue of the quarterly on technology and policy. I want to start with a little poll. How many here do not want to see humans go to Mars? Okay, that's not a shocking response from this crowd. How many people want to go to Mars, personally? Like about mostly. How many people want to live on Mars? Okay, mostly the same people. They just don't want to visit, they want to go there. How many people want to raise a family on Mars? Okay, now we're kind of narrowing things down. But you are the people that this talk is about. And I should note the irony of this, because I personally do not give a rat's toot about Mars. But I do care about seeing large numbers of people living off the planet and being able to go live wherever they want to go. And if you're interested in settling Mars, which if you're raising a family, almost by definition, that's what you're doing, right? Property rights are going to be very, very important. And it's a very problematic situation right now. So I want to start by talking about visions of space. And Rick Tomlinson talks about this. I saw this on the program. I don't know if he spoke it tonight or not. But Rick talks about 3 visions of space. He talked about the Saganian, Carl Sagan mission, the what he calls von Brownian mission, and what I call Apolloism, and the O'Neillian mission. And the Sagan mission is Earth is a beautiful, or space is a beautiful jewel. Look, but don't touch. Even though Carl kind of backed off on that later, he decided, yeah, it's okay at least to send humans out to explore. The von Brownian vision, or Apolloism, is the notion that only governments can do space, and they will be the vanguard of humanity in space. And the O'Neillian vision is thousands, millions of people living and working in space, and this is the Jeff Bezos vision as well. So I want to tell a little story. You've probably heard these debates before. I was up in Seattle last November, I think, for a conference put on by The Economist. And so they sponsored one of these debates, which you always hear. Should we go to the moon? Should we go to Mars and other places? Or or should we not send people anywhere else? And these debates always infuriate me because it's a false choice based on a false premise. The question is, who is the we that we're talking about here? You know, it assumes that there's some collective societal decision that we have to make, choose this planet or that planet, or not to go at all. And so I made that point, when they take Q&A, because the answer is some of us are going to go to the moon, some of us are going to go to Mars, some of us are going to go to Ceres, some of us are, once they get out of the gravity well, they're not going to want to go back down into another one. And some people, in fact, most people, are not going to go anywhere because most people are homebodies and people want to live on other planets or mutant weirdos. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but honestly, they are. But the other thing was that in arguing that we wouldn't go anywhere, sometimes the argument is made, well, we haven't even built ocean colonies, just on the seabed. Why would we do space? Okay, there's lots of reasons that's a dumb argument. But the other one they use is we haven't settled Antarctica. We have some research stations there, but nobody's going there and living and raising families. And at this point, like steam's coming out of my ears. And Jeff Grayson is sitting next to me, and so he stands up and says, there's a reason that we haven't settled Antarctica, because people who live there can't own the land, they can't work the land, they cannot borrow against the land, they cannot pass the land on to their children, and the reason for that is because of the Antarctic Treaty. And so it comes to the problem of space. Because the Outer Space Treaty was in fact based on the Antarctic Treaty. So it essentially, at the time it was passed 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, 51 now, space was just envisioned as a province of governments. And nobody imagined people were actually going to be going up there and doing stuff on their own. So it was modeled on Antarctica, where it was just a realm of science and exploration. Fortunately, it's now 6 decades since we've been doing space stuff, a little over. And it's becoming finally acceptable to talk about space settlements in Hawaii. But unfortunately, the policy is not yet caught up with it. But it's starting to. And as I say, the Outer Space Treaty was compatible with the Sagan vision and with the Brownian approach. It is completely incompatible with the O'Neill approach, or at least with the notion that people are going to be living on other planets. But change is on the way, in fact, with the new administration. Even though they've refocused on the moon, there is recognition of the importance of ability to use the resources there, not just there, but in space in general. So there's actually a sea change. Jim Bridenstine the new NASA administrator, gave a speech. He's been talking about things like, reuse. He said, we're not going to go back to the moon unless we reuse stuff. And same thing would apply to Mars. And he says we need to use extraterrestrial resources, we need to do space assembly, we need to do all these, we need CubeSat, see what we can do with those. So he's probably the most openly visionary NASA administrator we've ever had. Maybe Tom Paine was to that degree, but he's saying the kinds of things that would certainly Charlie Bolden would never have said. So that's good news. The other good news is that we've reestablished a space commission. It's nominally headed by Mike Pence, just because there's a tradition of vice presidents being in charge of space going all the way back to LBJ. But the person who's actually running the Space Council is Professor Scott Pace from the LA School at George Washington University. And I personally have known Scott, been a colleague and friend for almost 40 years. So that was a good choice. And he is he is very visionary as well. He was a member of the L5 Society, and he's been very, in fact, he was very heavily involved with it. And the same thing with when it came to National Space Society. I can't remember what roles that he had in leadership. The space science community is starting to figure this out. I was at the Lunar Science for Land Missions workshop at Ames in January, and the people there are figuring out that they've got to be doing more than just pure science and understanding the origin of the moon. They need to figure out how can we actually utilize the resources there to enable other stuff, including more exploration. And Blue Origin was there. They're recognizing that they may get there by means other than rides on NASA. So all this stuff is good. In December, at the Galloway Space Law Symposium in DC, Scott gave a speech that contains hints of what the future of space policy may hold. And he laid out 6 key policy goals. First, that U.S. policy will prioritize the interests of the United States and its friends. The United States will be the most friendly jurisdiction for private sector participation and innovation in space. The U.S. government will use legal and diplomatic means to create a stable and peaceful environment for both government and commercial space activities. I'm paraphrasing. Well, by the way, there's more extensive than that. Fourth, the private sector must have confidence that we'll be able to profit from capital investments made in space activities and infrastructure. Fifth, we need to resolve questions and ambiguities in the existing treaty structure about property ownership and rights. So clearly the administration this is really the first administration that's thought about this. And finally, there's a need to develop international norms through both bottom-up best practices with partners and top-down non-binding confidence-building measures without a need for changing existing treaties and arms agreements. Because of this, he was dealing with military issues as well, not just private space. So those are the 6 policy goals we laid out. Now, a key element of the speech, and I'm going to actually quote this, there was a shot across the bow of some countries, such as Russia, with dramatic implications for the future of space development. So he said, quote, outer space is not a global commons, nor the common heritage of mankind. It's not res communis, nor is it a public good. These concepts are not part of the Outer Space Treaty, and the United States has consistently taken the position that these ideas do not describe the legal status of outer space. Reference to these concepts is more distracting than it is helpful. To unlock the promise of space, to expand the economic sphere of human activity beyond the Earth, requires that we do not constrain ourselves with legal constructs that do not apply to space. End quote. So these are all international legal terms of our res communis, common, this stuff. The Outer Space Treaty, to which we and all spacefaring nations are signatories, declares space activities, quote, the province of all mankind. That is, it's a region in which all people who wish and can afford to participate can participate. The 1979 Moon Agreement, to which no spacefaring nation has acceded, used the phrase common heritage of mankind, implying that it is a commons that must be shared. There are a lot of people who would still like us, like the U.S., to sign on to that agreement. But it's worth noting that one reason space activists have fought against the Law of the Sea Treaty for years was that the Moon Treaty was modeled on it. And the Law of the Sea Treaty was to figure out how do you apportion the profits from seabed mining, basically. And one of the reasons we haven't done much seabed mining is because of the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though we never have ratified. So it would be a terrible precedent for the ability to mine space resources if we were to sign on to the Moon Agreement. So let's talk about the importance of property rights for a minute. Hernando de Soto I think he still is, a Peruvian, I think he's still alive, Peruvian economist, he's still an economist, a Peruvian economist who wrote a book that I just remember the name of right now, but it was about the differences in the economies of Anglo-America, that is Canada and the U.S., and Latin America, which is everything below Canada and the U.S., the first order. And he pointed out that there's a lot of this poor economic growth and income inequality of Latin America was a result of the fact of how, basically the Spanish legal system that it established. It was kind of a feudal system. Whereas North America, Anglo-America, was founded, with the exception of Louisiana and Quebec, based on English common law. And that included title property with deeds that was registered and that the government would support. So Latin America didn't have this. Anglo-America did, and it made a huge difference in terms of industrial growth and wealth. And this English common law tradition goes all back to medieval times, all the way back to the Domesday Book, which kind of recorded who lived where and who owned what. So that's what we have today in this country. You buy a house, you get a deed, you own the property that it's on, you got the mineral rights to it, and so on. So we need to remove these ambiguities about property rights for space settlements. Now, there's not going to be a legal issue if somebody goes out and builds an O'Neill colony, because this outer space treaty doesn't really apply to that. You can, it's an artificial structure, and you just like own a condo in it or something, right? But if you're on a planetary body, a celestial body, which by the way is not defined anywhere, so that makes things even more interesting. But clearly, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that the moon is a celestial body and Mars is a celestial body. And right now, it's difficult under many interpretations of the Outer Space Treaty to actually own property on a planet. So a lot of people argue, and not people per se, lawyers argue. I kid. I've got a lot of friends who are so many of my now former friends claim that rights are either insecure under or outright prohibited by two articles in the OST. The first one, Article 2, prohibits national appropriation by claiming sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. That's Article 6 demands continuing supervision by governments of non-governmental activities. So the argument is that in order to enforce a property right, the state must have sovereignty over the land on which the property lies, which is prohibited by Article 2. And if a private individual tried to make a property claim and the government were to recognize it, even if it weren't going to defend it, if it merely recognized it, it wouldn't be in keeping with its duty as a state's party to the treaty to properly continually supervise its non-governmental individual or corporate persons. So that's the issue. There's another problem with the treaty in terms of settlement, which is Article 9, which requires that states exploring celestial bodies must, quote, avoid their harmful contamination and also adverse changes in the environment of the Earth resulting from the introduction of extraterrestrial matter. So, like the phrase celestial bodies, what counts as harmful or adverse is not defined. And even liberally, you'd think these terms could be prohibited to any meaningful human settlement of planets or moons or the use on Earth of resources mined from them. So Scott Pace is well aware of these longstanding issues, and that's why he had all this made that strategic alleyway. It's the language about being able to be friendly with the private sector, being able to profit from investment. It's indicative, I think, of a pivot this new administration from the Apolloistic and Saganian models to a more O'Neillian one that envisions people, Americans and others, living and working in space for their own private purposes. So this really is a huge change in attitude. If you've been following space policy for a few decades, that's a really big difference in the way the federal government is looking at this stuff. And it's a good thing. So about 10 years ago, John Marburger, the late John Marburger, he was George W. Bush's science advisor, gave a speech, I think, at the Goddard Symposium, talking about expanding the economic sphere beyond the Earth. And so Scott's call does the same thing. It echoes that. And now it's not just a science advisor, but we have a space council, and he's the head of it. He understands the levers of power in Washington. So I think we can expect good things to be happening in that regard. He gave a speech at the Hudson Institute a few weeks ago, 3 months ago, where he described the Outer Space Treaty as, quote, permissive with regard to the state and national objectives. Now, I would put it a different way, and this is what I've been talking about with various people, including other countries. I was in Vienna at the legal subcommittee meeting in April, and I received fairly friendly reception from many people. But the idea was of mine is to make the solar system safe for traditional English common law, while at the same time not requiring it that it be universally applied. If people want to do something different in some places, that's fine. But we believe that we should extend this system that works very well here out into space, out into the solar system. So I think one of the things that Scott is thinking about, and I've actually discussed it with him, and I've also talked to Gabriel Swinney, who is our representative to Copios, specifically with regard to space resources, is to do multilateral agreements. And in fact, just this past week, Gabriel tweeted, space resources are the most important medium-term issue that we have. And that was his personal opinion, but it's pretty clear that this government, this administration is going to be very friendly. And we've passed legislation. Luxembourg has passed national legislation last year, and we passed some similar one that says, yeah, we think our people can use space resources. And it's kind of important really to be pushing hard on this right now, because the Russian government announced last fall, that it actually wanted to outlaw the use of space resources, even though they're acting like they want to set up the regime of the Moon Agreement, even though they're not a signatory to it. So that's kind of weird. So anyway, my current plan my proposal under the current circumstances is to develop multilateral agreements, both within the Anglosphere, that is us, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, maybe South Africa if they don't go crazy, India, so all the places that already have English common law, but also anybody else who wants to join in, such as really Luxembourg is interested, and I've talked to them, and in Japan, maybe Israel, maybe the UAE. We're not going to say it's only an Anglosphere thing, but it clearly is an Anglosphere thing. And part of that would include probably getting this Australia out of the Moon Agreement, because now they have a space agency, they claim to want to do space, space. And they have mining companies, I'm sure, who are championing them to get involved in this in outer space mining. So we should, part of the agreement, probably get them to withdraw from the Moon Agreement, because it's the two treaties are fundamentally incompatible with each other. So Professor Sergio Marchisio at the University of Rome has in fact argued this at Copios. It says you can be a signatory to the OST, or you can be a signatory to the Moon Agreement, but you can't be both. It's like saying, I like Christianity, but Judaism is kind of cool too. I think I'll be both. You have to make a choice. Even though everybody who signed up to the Moon Agreement, all 18 countries, none of which has ever launched much grapefruit into orbit, they're also signatories to the OST, but in my opinion, they should not be. So anyway, I would like to get Australia out, and I would also like to see this government, our government, not merely, Jimmy Carter signed the Moon Agreement, but the Senate never ratified. I would like to see the administration actively repudiate it, just to make a point. So what would these multilateral agreements look like? I haven't drafted anything, but I think they'd be based on following principles. First, as I just said, an understanding of the distinction between the province of all mankind language of the Outer Space Treaty versus common heritage of all mankind of the Moon Agreement. and how they're fundamentally philosophically incompatible with each other. Next, all states parties to these agreements or agreement will recognize property claims of individuals from any nation, including citizens not of those states parties, subject to certain conditions. And of course, those conditions are wherein lie the details of the devil's in the lot, trying to figure out what that is. But I would propose that we start with, we have stuff that's worked in history, the 1862 Homestead Act and 1872 Mining Law could be useful models. Basically, what it's going to say is you have to inhabit the property for some designated period of time, and you have to approve it in some sense in order to gain the title. So it continues to be legally absurd to say if we and these other countries, not just us, not just the U.S., if all of these countries part of this agreement will recognize the claim of not just our own citizens, but anybody, I don't see how that could possibly be called, logically be called national appropriation under Article 2. Okay. I think it's important to distinguish between resources used in space for personal use, that is like basically living off the land, life support, water, making oxygen, whatever. We need to distinguish between that and resources for commercial use. For example, mining the moon for water and then selling propellant to Elon to some people on Mars. Okay, so those would be two distinctions, but they would both be allowed. But there's a third, the most important distinction is the use of space resources that are then brought and injected into the terrestrial economy. Because the latter is what the people who wanted to have the moon agreement were more concerned with, because the idea was that for bringing in massive amounts of platinum or whatever, then the countries whose basic economies, these developing nations that live by extractive industries, you might plunge the cost so much that you damage their own prospects for growth. So the idea was to have some kind of mechanism by which they could be compensated for that. So actually bring resources from space into Earth and selling them on Earth, like everybody talks about the $1 trillion, platinum asteroid or something silly, but that's the kind of thing, that we need to deal with in terms of how to placate the moon agreement supporters. Along the same lines, we have to recognize the utter impracticality of space resource utilization, quote, benefiting every nation on an equal basis without discrimination. Because that was a wording that a lot of people were using in the exchange of views in Vienna this past April. For example, the notion of sale of liquid oxygen from the moon to Elon for a trip to Mars should somehow benefit Botswana is absurd. So one way we might think about dealing with this is if you actually do bring something in, if you can put a tariff on it, you can set up some corrupt thing to satisfy them that can then take those resources and provide a development bank or something that would allow other countries maybe to set up a space program. But that's the kind of thing we could talk about without actually setting up this regime of the moon agreement. Finally, I'd say that we have to have a permissive interpretation of Article 9 that doesn't preclude humans landing on Mars due to the need for planetary protection, while at the same time ensuring the preservation of heritage sites. Like on the moon. I don't know if Michelle Hanlon has an organization called For All Moonkind, and she's been promoting this, how do we preserve the Apollo sites. So we have to have something that tries to find that line between preserving historical things, but also allowing people, and in the future, maybe we have to allow urban renewal of some kind, but that's what is up in the future. So finally, we have to recognize that this proposal will not be without controversy. There are many people, both inside and outside the U.S., who do not, in fact, share an expansive vision of humanity in space, and some who believe that humanity is sufficiently problematic that it's really kind of this cancer that evolved on this planet has to be confined to this planet and not be allowed to spread out over the solar system. But yet another battle we have to wage. But if we base our new policies on these sorts of principles, I think after more than a century of dreams of activity in space and visions, this goes back all the way 1894. John Jacob Astor wrote a book, about space colonization. I think with what's going on, if we have this policy in place and the new technologies and these wealthy new visionaries will finally enable all the most expansive space visions that we've been having for so long. Any questions?
Yeah.
Rand, regarding Article 2, I think that one of the things we need to look at is the fact that the drafting of it was pretty bad, and the Earth is a celestial object, and therefore all of the precedent in the law of nations is that that res nullis is subject to national appropriation, and that the article has to be seen as just preposterous. I mean, that's it. Well, your thoughts on that?
Well, I should say that, when I first started this project, because I actually was being funded to actually start this project back in January, I poked around in DC and I talked to the State Department, and I talked to Scott, and I talked to Jim Muncie and other people, and said, okay, well, we want to make the Outer Space Treaty more friendly for space travel. That is basically the goal of the project. And they say, okay, but we are not going to renegotiate the treaty. We are not that, and that's why Scott gave that speech. He's basically saying, you space lawyers can go pound sand. We're going to interpret the treaty the way I'm saying we're going to interpret the treaty. So it's a question of properly interpreting that badly written treaty. Not trying to, because it would be a huge can of worms to renegotiate that. It would be the same thing people worry about having a convention of the states, right? You don't know what's going to come out of that, and Russia could cause all kinds of issues if we start to renegotiate. So that was kind of taken off the table. We're going to properly interpret that treaty.
We got another question here, and bring over here.
Could you explain how this applies to stateless people such as the Rohingya?
No. I don't think they're likely to be trying to go to space.
So Rand, so the people on the moon and Mars or elsewhere who are living there, if they, at a certain point, maybe 50, 60,000, whatever, if they were to establish their own constitution and choose their own government, elect their own government at that time, could they define themselves as a new political entity that has not signed up to the Outer Space Treaty, and therefore they have property rights?
Sure.
But is that too late? We need property rights before that point.
We need property rights before that point, I think. Well, because it gets back to, and I wrote a paper on this, an issue analysis when I was at the head of Enterprise Institute 6 years ago. It said the reason property rights are important, many reasons, but if you want, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, you have to have something you can borrow against. If you want to raise money just to develop land, you need to own the land, and you need to be able to say, okay, here's the title of the land, here's the deed, and we'll put this up against a loan. So you can have a mortgage, and then you can build stuff, you can raise money. But without that, it's really, you don't have any collateral if you don't own the property.
Another question here?
Yeah. I like the 1987 Outer Space Treaty in that it did stop the militarization of outer space with satellites, as far as we know. It did stop a possible war, but I think the Outer Space Treaty needs to be improved. Needs to be stronger and better and more democratic. I can't think of any kind of international treaty that would have any meaning if it excluded over half of the entire world's population. Countries like China, India, the Philippines, Russia.
It doesn't. It does not.
And let me finish, please. So, and if you are in favor, if we're in favor of an international treaty that will place tough international regulations and controls over what individuals do on Mars to make a profit, what kinds of elements would you like to see in that sort of treaty? So that we don't have just a free-for-all where everyone can do their thing as long as they're trying to make money. I think we need to regulate that, because without any international regulations, it will be a free-for-all. There could be wars, and they could really do some damage to the planet. And I'm worried about that. I don't want to see that. I want to see the scientific exploration of Mars, and I don't want to see people doing any damage to that planet over territory or that's. I'm glad they won't have cleaner unclean coal on Mars, because some people say, hey, let's get some coal from Mars. So what do you think about that anyway? An international treaty.
Well, I'm not proposing any new, I'm proposing multilateral agreements. I don't know what damage Mars looked like. I don't know what damaging a balloon that's popped craters and getting new ones every day looks like. But I think I would note that countries that have operated under English common law don't tend to make war on each other. But, I think that we can make things work pretty well in space the way we, over time, have come to make things work pretty well here. So I guess if you want to draft up a treaty, people will debate it and consider it and so on. And by the way, the Outer Space Treaty did not prevent the militarization of space. Space was militarized from day one, and it continues to be. There's all this nonsense that people don't talk about. Oh, the Space Force is going to cause a war. Well, no, Space Force is not creating militarization of space. It's responding to it. It's recognizing it. All the Outer Space Treaty prevents is weapons of mass destruction in orbit and military bases on other bodies. But it does not prevent the militarization of space, because we have, DoD has a bigger space budget than NASA does.
Another question here, and I got two more over here.
What's wrong with the current status of ambiguity? Large extractive companies are used to going into lawless places, semi-lawless places, extracting minerals and making money. Whatever major economic activities. Extracting water might be the first. All someone has to do is incorporating Luxembourg in the US, do what they want. And at some point, some government will come into existence.
Well, the problem, I don't think there's an issue with resource utilization right now. I think there's semi-consensus in the state legal community that if you go out and you mine water on the moon, you can use the water, you can sell the water, you could even, if you were so stupid, bring the water back to Earth and try and sell it here. Actually that might, maybe people would pay money for moon water. I don't know. But that's not the issue. That's not what really what my talk is about, because I don't think that's, because people have Russia's brought back samples, we have Apollo samples, and we have a legal precedent for them being exchanged for tokens of value. So that's not a problem. The problem is owning land. That's what I'm trying to address, because we need that for stuff.
We got another question here.
Practically speaking, realistically, seems like treaties can be made obsolete and irrelevant by a lack of enforcement. The Treaty of Versailles being a good example.
Yeah, no, and that ultimately will happen. I always like to say that in some sense, the Outer Space Treaty, and particularly the Moon Agreement, are like the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope basically said, I'm going to split the New World down this line, and Portugal gets this much, and Spain gets the rest. Okay, it didn't work out that way. Exactly.
Thank you for answering my question.
But the question is not what are we doing 30 years from now. It's how do we deal with, if we want to go there now, how can we do that within the current international legal framework?
I was gonna ask you a question about, the Pope's division of the world for Spain and Portugal in the context of, it's hard to rethink all this stuff. It's like trying to rethink terraforming because we don't know the market or the resources or what's gonna drive us to space economically. We're all kind of research people here. We have an idea and love about commercial use, but we don't have the thirst and the lust and the taste for going there. We don't have the sugar plantation problem, the sugar problem that Europeans had, the so-called spice trade. And we haven't found the gold there yet that the Queen will hawk her jewels for to get.
Unfortunately, we haven't found brown people to subjugate, and I hope we won't.
That's a good thing. Thanks.
We have another couple questions over there before I go over there and get your questions. Is John Mackins in the room? Is Mike Dunn in the room? Oh, Mike Dunn? Okay.
Hi, this is sort of a response to his question over there. Who would you trust to negotiate a new treaty and create new regulations that do not make it impossible for people interested in harvesting resources for commercial use to make a profit for their activities?
Well, right now, I would trust our current State Department, frankly, because I've been talking to them and they are very much in favor.
We got one last question, and I have our next speaker ready to start.
Why would Russia be against the utilization of space resources? It seems like they have just as much to gain as anybody else. And so what's China's position on all this?
When Russia came out with that announcement last year, all of us were scratching our heads. And I think probably even some of the Russian space companies are saying, WTF? Yeah. As don't ask me what motivates Putin. But as far as China, I'm sure that they want to do this. And it's just, I've never been very concerned about China, actually, but I'm starting to do a little bit because now they're kind of unleashing their own private sector in space. But I'm sure they wouldn't be unamenable, probably, to. I'm sure they want to use those resources too. So, we'll see if we start to do these negotiations, these multilateral agreements. We'll see if China wants to play.
Okay, that concludes the copyright by Randall Timber. Now we're going to shift over here. We have Mike Dunn, who's scheduled at 10:30. John Mankins just walked in, so we'll get him fitted back into the loop. And we'll start off with Mike Dunn shortly. And then we have Chris back. He's here also. All right, we have our regular scheduled speaker here for the 10:30 on the moon lava tube stimulations. This is Mike Dunn. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm usually the crusty old guy in the back of the picture somewhere in Antarctica or down below the surface of the sea with the grizzly beard and the ice axe in one hand and maybe the regular Edgar in the other, rolling my eyes back at the scientists or sticking the thermometers at the penguins or tagging the leopard seals. So this morning you're going to get a little bit different view, the view from our side, which is the guys that are out there in the field that are actually probably at some point in time going to have to design, develop, maintain, and eventually staff the habitats that could potentially eventually go on the moon and Mars. So with that said, what I'm going to talk about this morning is our efforts relative to taking a look at lava tubes as potential alternatives for placing those types of habitats in the future. Well, there's obviously a number of potential advantages to using lava tubes for locations for habitats on the moon and Mars. And some of those you see up on the screen. Obviously, a reduction in radiation exposure would be one. The idea that we could also move into a lava tube in the event of a dust storm, not only for the habitat, not only for the inhabitants themselves, but also the equipment. You can imagine what a long-term dust storm would do to the type of equipment that would be on the surface if that's where your facility was at. There's also the concept that within subterranean areas, you have a less wide change in temperatures. That's true pretty much in any type of cave, natural cave, or lava tube environment. Also, as you have seen during a number of the other presentations that have been here over the last few days, there's a much more focus on taking a look at the potential for searching for life in subterranean environments and also search for water. Now, obviously, if that's one of your goals and you have access to a cave system of some sort that's nearby, that allows you a potential opportunity to take and combine those, where basically your facility would be in a location that's very close to the areas that you would be exploring. But the real issue, the real concept here is basically a reduction in the mass and volume associated with lifting everything you need to live on another planet off the surface of Earth into orbit and then onto the location of wherever your facility should be. Now that said, you have to have the lava tubes out there. They have to be prolific enough to there and in locations where you would think that they could serve that purpose. But when we first started our look at this about a decade ago, there was very little information on what was out there. But as time progressed, basically what happened was more and more information came in to demonstrate that there is really a potential for these types of configurations for lava tubes and subsurface caves to be in locations that we might consider using for this purpose. So what we're looking at potentially at this point in time is one potential alternative among many that we can take a look at relative to putting in habitats and facilities both on the moon and on Mars. That said, there is one issue from our point of view, ours meaning the guys out in the field, that really rings some alarm bells for us. And that's what this slide demonstrates here. That is, to this point in time, the facilities, at least the ones I've been involved with, that have been established in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and those in sub-mariner locations, underwater habitats, not a single one of those has ever been designed or conceived for the purpose of eventually carrying forward onto creating a self-sustained community. Our last speaker explained a lot of reasons why in the Antarctic Treaty that would be the case. But basically, what we are saying is, okay, guys, let's step back and take a look here for a minute. We know we want to go to the moon and establish a facility. We know that we want to go to Mars and establish a facility. But the reality is, even though we're pretty good at putting bases at the South Pole and flying in LC-130s to resupply it, we have no experience at then taking a remote or hazardous environment location and turning it eventually into a self-sustaining or complex of some sort. Well, let's step back a little bit. We know that any objective, anything that we want to accomplish, the human species usually takes 3 types of process approaches to. We only really do 3 things when we're doing anything, be it buying vegetables at the store for dinner or going to Mars. Those 3 processes are simply solving problems, making decisions, and implementing plans. In my world, a problem has a very specific definition: deviation of actual, or should, or causes unknown, and it's of concern. When I step out of a habitat somewhere in the Antarctic and get into a snowcat and turn the key and it doesn't start, I have deviation of actual from should. That sucker should be starting and it's not. I don't know why it's not starting, and it's of concern to me because I need that, excuse me, I need that snowcat for a specific purpose. All right, well, there's 2 things I can do about that, and that's the same in pretty much any kind of program. And that is, I can either find the cause and correct it, in which case it completely goes away, or I can adapt to it. And adaptation means that if the battery's dead and the next battery is 2,000 miles away at true value in Punta Arenas, Chile, excuse me, I'm going to have a bit of a problem, so I am going to have to adapt to the situation. Well, the same basically holds true with any kind of human type of effort that we take. Example is with decisions. We have an object and an action in a decision. I get a new job. I want to buy a car to get to the new place. Well, what have I just done? I've said basically I have an object and an action. I want to buy a car. But what I have really done is I have eliminated a number of potential viable opportunities and alternatives associated with what I'm trying to accomplish. And that's one of the things that's of primary concern to us is how are we going to go about defining actually what we're going to do on Mars? Are we simply saying, well, humans to Mars? Well, there's your objects in action. But there's also expanding that, and that's where viable alternatives come in. We can also say, basically, establish a human presence on another planet. Okay, it's a wider type of objective, but it's the one that basically changes the value system of the different alternatives. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, it's simply because we need to really take a look at what is the end game. What are we trying to do? We've got all these puzzle pieces. We have lots of speakers. We have lots of people all over the world, and they're basically saying different things. They're saying, some of them are saying, we're going to establish a base on Mars. Some are saying, no, should we establish the base first on the moon? And then should it be a long-term established base? Should it be one that basically evolves into a community? So we don't have a real consensus there. So that throws a real monkey wrench from our point of view into which alternative we should look at in relationship to proceeding forward. Well, if you take a look at most of the alternatives that are available for service-type facilities, for temporary facilities, or even for facilities that are eventually going to become self-sustaining, and you filter out all of the basic different alternatives and what you wanted to do and what you needed to do, there's one that seems to pop up over and over, always in the top 2 or 3, and that's lava tubes. Basically, what we're saying is that if we look at and focus on lava tubes for natural cave systems, for locations, for facilities on the moon and Mars, we have basically mitigated to a certain degree whether the the end goal ends up being, just putting people on Mars at a facility or putting people on the moon at a facility, because the infrastructure necessary, the engineering, the putting together of all the subparts, the life support systems, the agronomy, all of that basically stays awfully close to the same. There are some deviations. For example, it would be very difficult for us to survey the inside of a lava tube to determine how big to put an inflatable habitat using a drone on the moon. We are looking at, given some of the stuff that JPL is doing, the possibility of playing around with that on Mars. But the reality here is that when we're looking at going off to another location, going off to the moon, going off to Mars, and we have no historical model that allows us to create a transition from a temporary type facility to a permanent type facility anywhere on the planet. We haven't done that yet. So we're stepping back and saying, okay, what's a good way to approach this? What's a good way to look at maybe taking all of these different ideas, all these different concepts, and focusing them into one area, into one regimen? Well, in the past, historically, the way we did this, basically, with facilities in the Antarctic, is we got everybody together. We built basically prototype facilities. We did this for a number of the Asian countries, of which won't be named at this point in time. But in essence, what we did, because they had no experience whatsoever with Antarctic facilities, is we had them build a prototype of what they thought they were going to need in country. They then went through and tested them to a certain degree, and then they put them on ships and they shipped them down to the Antarctic. But before they got to the Antarctic, we took them one more time and put them on a dock and built them through their guys inside to see if they had everything they needed before they were going to winter over for the first time. And sure enough, in almost every case, they did not. So somebody opened the door, went down to the local ferreteria, to the hardware store, got whatever he needed, and came back. So the reality is what we're doing is we're decreasing the potential for having issues associated with risk environments that would otherwise be a real challenge. We contend that that same thing holds true in relationship to how we need to approach looking at habitats, both lunar and Mars. And the reason I keep coming back to the moon is because the moon, in essence, is the dock and Punta Arenas, Chile, and Antarctica is Mars. From our standpoint, we don't put subsurface facilities 6,000 feet below the surface of the ocean the first time. We put them in 30 feet of water off of Key Largo and see what happens and see what we need to do in order to take the next step. And in addition to that, because with using lava tubes, we're in a situation where we can then take and use almost all of those same systems, those subsystems, all in one place again. It gives us a much higher probability of basically being successful at what we're doing. I'd like each of you to remember 4 words here. It's really interesting because a couple of months ago, one of our geologists did a slide presentation at Lava Beds National Monument in California. And it was done on basically the concepts and foundations from the science side, from the geology side, not from the applications and general systems side, which is my bailiwick. And that is on YouTube. And if you just remember the words cave, man, Mars, 4th planet, you can access that video. It's a little longer than this presentation, but it is really kind of eye-opening in what we're attempting to do and how we're attempting to do it. Martin Gasser, who is basically the geologist in Switzerland, also works with us in Iceland, who made that presentation, will also be doing the same presentation in Europe at an ESA conference in Berlin in October. So we decided that this seemed like a really good way to go, that the lava tubes provided all kinds of potential advantages, and that the ability to basically come down and focus all of this into one area. With that, we basically selected, I've gotten a 5-minute thing, so I'm going to try to do the Reader's Digest condensed version here a little bit. But we picked a place in Iceland, and that cave system in Iceland that we picked has 3 basic vertical entrances and 3 horizontal entrances. And we also basically have done a number of things in Iceland. We've formed, are forming a nonprofit part of our organization. We have basically displays inside of the museum in Husavik, and we have basically a real strong support from the local community. A lot of that was because a lot of the geology training for the astronauts, for the Apollo astronauts, was done in that area. So, in essence, what we're trying to do, and what our goal is, and it's not a goal relative simply to the company, it's a goal relative to having the entire Mars community step back and take a look at where's a focal point we can take all of these various ideas and concepts and everything and bring them into the field and test them. Not as standalone components, which we used to get a lot with subsea habitat stuff, where we did something and say, gee, that's great. That's probably the coolest thing we'll ever put in there. It doesn't fit. So we could bring all of this stuff in, create basically an environment where we can test on Earth, decide, get rid of the politics, decide whose idea is best, who has the resources, and whatever, and eventually create a turnkey facility that could then go, in essence, to the moon, which could then be tested and then taken off into Mars. We have no interest in who has the scooter ships to get you to San Francisco so you can go get the gold. That's basically SpaceX, NASA, ESA, and everybody else's bailiwick. What we're trying to do is coordinate and bring everybody together from the standard idea and concept of taking all of that information and putting it into one kind of working environment, which is lava tubes. We're also looking at other locations. I just finished a 5,500-mile trip across the United States on dirt roads and basically identifying different longitudes and different locations where we can do the same sort of thing in the United States, predominantly because Iceland is not workable through the entire winter period. So I want to finish with one little story here, actually 2. I'm sure you all get this. I get it a lot. Well, why do we want to go to Mars? Why do we want to spend all this money to go to Mars and take people to Mars? Shouldn't we be fixing Earth? My typical response is, you know, that would be a really, really good question to ask the dinosaurs. You know, I think if they had the opportunity, they might have considered putting some of their species at another location and having a contingency plan. And finally, I want to talk about a little story. It won't take too long here. And that is, back in 1985, I had the wonderful opportunity to lead one of my expeditions to the geographic North Pole that included 2 unique individuals on it. One of them was Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. The other one was Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to summit Mount Everest. Along with myself, a gentleman named Steve Fawcett, whose name some of you may recognize from solo flying a balloon around the world. Another gentleman by the name of Pat Morrow, who was the first person to climb 7 summits. Also on the trip was Peter Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary's son. And we had our den mother, a lady by the name of Betty Wolf. And Betty was this crusty old lady who got coffee and did whatever she needed to do. But she came from Arizona. So when she got her kit, and we sent her all the information, everything she needed to survive up on the Arctic Sea, she got a pair of what we call the standard mittens that most people see or recognize. The big red mitten that fits on your hand. It has a little black strap and a little black thing to wipe your nose with. And so Betty got her mittens. And she put them in her bag, and off to the trip we went. Well, it turned out that the people who built her mittens put the right thumb in the left glove and the left thumb in the right glove. So this was Betty the whole trip. And it became on that expedition kind of a high sign for everybody. Hey, Betty, is there any more coffee available? And we all kind of chuckled. Well, at the end of the trip, we're sitting in a place called the Narwhal Hotel in Resolute Bay, and in the Northwest Territories of Canada, getting ready to leave. And Ed Hillary and Peter Hillary and I are sitting at the table drinking coffee. And Betty comes in. She slaps a piece of paper down on the table. And she puts a pin there. And she says, Ed, I want you to write a note to the guys that made these gloves for me and tell them they suck. And we chuckled and said, that's great, you know. So Ed picks up the piece of paper and he says, with gloves like this, I could have never made it to the summit of Mount Everest. Signed, Shred and Hillary, May 10th, 1985. And we're just having a little time laughing. And Neil Armstrong's coming downstairs from upstairs where the bed areas were, and he said, what are you guys all laughing about? He says, look at this thing that Ed signed for Betty. He says, give me that. And below Ed's thing, he said, with gloves like this, I would have never made it to the moon. Signed, signed Neil Armstrong, May 10th, 1985. The point of the story is that we here are the individuals that are going to be responsible for ensuring that the first guys that get to Mars don't have Betty's gloves. Any questions?
Yeah, any questions? I have the first question here.
Hi. Can lava tubes be located from orbit, or do you have to go down to the surface and poke around?
The vertical entrances we can spot pretty easily. The horizontal, not so much, but there's a very interesting work being done by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Honda at the University of Tokyo, where he is taking a look at some of the imaging and being able to, from there, with the outflows from the lava tubes, extrapolate how large some of the lava tubes on Mars are and where the locations are.
We have another question over here.
Hi, Mike. I have a real quick question. Can you share with us how, or any ideas how you're sealing off these tubes to be airtight? I mean, are you digging in pre-manufacturing parts, or are you actually in situ creating the seals? And you know what I mean? I just think the nooks and crannies.
Yeah, we're actually looking at kind of both. In the lava tube, we have two concepts. One is a normal facility that people will stay in, will be an inflatable a facility to start with. But we're big advocates of contingency plans. So if you have a way basically to seal off both ends of the lava tube, you can slightly pressurize the lava tube. It doesn't have to go up to 14.7 psi in order to create an atmosphere where if you have a failure in the flexible habitat, you can still survive inside the lava tube. One of the things, and one of the reasons we have this particular tube we're using in Iceland is it has a lot of human history. It's had some graffiti in it. It's been beat up a lot. So we're not basically taking a pristine lava tube and destroying it in the process of trying to figure out ways to change the porosity of the lava tube walls with various types of materials and 3D printing with local available materials in order to create an environment where the atmosphere won't bleed once you put it inside. The huge advantage to this, by the way, we were thinking originally was based upon who the explorers are going to be that's in there. But the agronomists came back to us and said, this is really a great idea, because as a community grows, you could move one of those walls farther and farther back to create larger and larger growing areas. And also there's the idea that if water is found in the subterranean area and you pressurize or even slightly pressurize the lava tube, you could change that from a solid state basically to a liquid state. So there's a lot of fun things going on relative to what we're doing, and there's a lot of challenges. And of course, it's not just us, it's a lot of different people. But like I say, what we're trying to do is step back and say, lots of ideas, lots of concepts, lots of different goals and objectives. And one way to polish those up and smooth them out and bring them all into one effort is through the field operations, what we do. So hopefully that somewhat answers your question.
Here's the next question. I got another question.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. I think a question that immediately comes up to me is in terms of location. If you are going to a lava tube, you have to go to where the lava tube is. But especially on the moon, but I think probably also on Mars, that may not be your first choice of location, especially at the moon, at the poles, where there's these peaks of persistent illumination, you've got power, you've got local sources of water, which would reduce your weekly shipment cost. If you can cover habitats, total robotically cover them with regolith, and you get a lot of the benefits of lava tube, why, can you make an argument for why letting nature choose location as opposed to you choosing locations is more favorable?
I think that's a great premise for a conference and meeting with JPL, NASA, us, and some other folks. Because quite honestly, I don't think at this point in time, there's been much value set on actually taking a look at, can we find lava tube locations that meet some of the criteria that you just explained? Because we really haven't focused a lot on it. So there may be avenues where we can say, okay, what's the weighted value of this? How important is the areas that we're looking at now versus the potential for the lava tube? This gets back to, are you building a research facility on the surface, or is your end goal to try to create a sustainable environment for a potential colony? So the answer to your question is everything's going to be a compromise. And how far you have to compromise to get into a lava tube right now, it's not that bad. 10 years ago, I would have said, nah, it's not happening. Right now, it's not that bad. And with additional looks, additional research, it may be even less of a problem.
We got 2 more questions.
Just to follow up on the previous question. We found ice, we found glaciers on Mars. It will be relatively easy to dig a hole, melt the water out, and create your own lava tube the size that you exactly want. So have you guys been working on these kind of concepts?
Yes, that's actually an excellent question. Because of the difference in gravity, the size of the lava tubes are different on Mars and the Moon. To what degree, we don't know. But one of the first things that we're going to want to do is we're not probably going to send explorers directly into lava tubes on Mars before we send robotic survey systems. And one of the things we're working on right now is what's the best way to survey a lava tube? A lot of people come back to us and say, wow, I look at that picture, I look down through the vertical entrance to the lava tube and there's a bunch of rocks there. Well, yes, there are, because that's where the top caved in. But once you get down into the lava tube, they, in most instances, tend to smooth out. And so outside of this arena, outside of the Mars Society, Mars interest area, there's groups of people like the folks that we were dealing with in Lava Beds National Monument that are starting to address those questions. So here's the interesting deal. That question would not have come up if the rest of this had started to look promising. And now that question is coming up, and we're going to start looking at the answers to it.
Hey, one last question?
Yes. There is a historical model for your example. They're called Neanderthals, and they were made extinct by a mobile and inventive surface living population. How does that work?
I don't know. But you know what? I'm probably going to think about it in the shower tonight a lot.
All right, let's do it. Thank you. Move on to simulation. Okay, we're going to go with our next speaker, which is Chris Zachney, and then we'll go back to John Marcus, and then to the special panel. So they have Chris come up front. And after Chris, we'll go with back to John Marcus. The elusive John Marcus is up here.
I'm over here. Okay.
All right, again, welcome this morning. We've been going through our speakers pretty well. I'm Bob Pace, one of the volunteers here at the Mars Society. And our next speaker right now is Chris Zachney, who's going to talk about drilling for water on Mars.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. And thanks very much to Bob for inviting me. How many of you read this book? How many of you did not read this book? Okay, so almost 20 years ago, I was doing PhD at UC Berkeley in drilling on Mars, and this book was one of the, in drilling on Mars many years ago. And actually it was 2 decades ago because that's what Vada said. This book was one of the instrumental books guiding me how to do this and showing me that actually going to Mars is possible. And another person I want to acknowledge is Larry. Stand up. Larry was running a class called Mars 2012 because we were hoping that by 2012 we're going to have humans roaming on the surface of Mars. It was a great class and I learned a lot. And this was one of another inspiration point. And as a side note, those of you who live in Manhattan, I had the opportunity to live there for a couple of years. There was a restaurant in Times Square called Mars 2012. And after 2012 was approaching, they changed the name to 2112. And then they went bankrupt. Yeah. It was great restaurant. It was sort of underground, and all the waiters were Martians. You had caves. It was just unbelievable. We had absolute blast. But I want to talk about something that's dear to my heart. About 2 things that I want to achieve in my lifetime. First one is how to find life on another planet, and the second one is to sustain human presence on Mars. So this is the human presence on Mars, and this is the topic I'm going to cover today. In situ resource utilization is a term given to essentially living off the land. And a lot of people associate ISRU as mining water and doing this kind of stuff. If you think about it, ISRU is being done now every single day. We're harvesting solar energy for our satellites. Harvesting this energy is some type of ISRU, but most of the ISRU I'll talk about here is to do with volatiles and specifically water. Why are we doing it? Something that I never learned when I was an engineering student. We never tell you that everything comes down to money. The difference between great engineer and not so great engineer is that great engineer can do stuff on a cheap. Anyone can do stuff if you have a lot of money. So ISRU makes human settlements possible. Okay, makes it cheap enough. If you consider how much mass is required to launch from Earth to put 1 kilogram on the surface of Mars, this is so-called gear ratio. It's 226 to 1. Every kilogram that we put on the surface of Mars, we need to launch 226 kilograms here on Earth. So now, if I have a gizmo that makes 1 kilogram of water on Mars, I do not have to launch 226 kilograms from the surface of Mars. If I have a gizmo that makes a ton of water on Mars, I don't have to launch 226 tons from the surface of Mars. The way to think about it, it's sort of imagine you're driving to New York City, it's 10,500 miles, and there are no gas stations on the way. So you go there, and there's no gas station in Manhattan either. So all the fuel you have to bring with you to come back to LA, that's around 2,000 pounds of fuel. So now imagine there is fuel waiting for you in Manhattan. So all of a sudden you don't have to drag 2,000 pounds of fuel with you in your car. You can just drag 1,000 pounds of fuel, and the other 1,000 pounds of cargo you can bring your family along. So this kind of stuff makes sense for us if we here on Earth, but it should start making sense for us when we do exploration. The vision that SpaceX has, big settlements, colonies on the surface of Mars will not be possible without ISRU. The basic 2 fundamental commodities include water and oxygen. Water you can grab from the ground, oxygen you can recover from CO2. And we have a couple of markets. First one is life support, sustained human presence, oxygen and water, propellant, methane and oxygen, and that's why SpaceX is developing methane oxygen rockets because you can actually get methane on Mars. Energy, fuel cell. So during a night when there's no solar power and the batteries kind of running low, you can kickstart your fuel cells. And obviously for agriculture, those of you who have seen Martian, they know what I'm talking about. When it comes to water deposits, you can divide all these water sources into 5 major buckets. First one is liquid water, okay? And there's actually liquid water on Mars. Second one is ice, and it can be divided into pure ice and the ice cemented ground. Then you have hydrated minerals, clays and gypsum. You also have water minerals in a regolith. It's not very much, but you still have some of this. And then you have atmosphere. So over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how do you get this resource from each of these locations, except for atmosphere. Energy required to recover water vapor from atmosphere is extremely high because you do not have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. Let's look at the liquid water. Just a few weeks ago, we discovered liquid water on Mars. A mile below South Pole ice cap, there is lakes. There's a couple of them. They actually saturated with salt, hypersaline, and they could be somewhere between -74 centigrade and -10 centigrade. And the water was talking about search for life on Mars. This not only could be a resource for us, water, but could be also a potential target for astrobiology. What you see at the bottom is sort of upside down because it's a South Pole. You can see surface and then these blue layers. These are all lakes discovered by Mars Express just recently. So Mars, all of a sudden, is getting very, very exciting. So the question is, how do you go there? How do you mine? Well, to figure it out, let's bring our attention to subglacial lakes on Earth. Just recently, also, we found saline lakes on Devon Island in the Arctic. With something like a half a kilometer of ice, and underneath this ice, we have lakes. This is something just recently discovered. So all of a sudden, we can go to Devon Island, drill into these lakes, and learn how to do drilling on Mars, just because we go to in this analog location. Another good spot is Lake Vostok. Lake Vostok is in Antarctica. It's a lake covered by 4 kilometers of ice. And actually, we managed to get down and drill into this lake. It took almost 20 years to do this, but we managed to do this, and we managed to sample some of this water. So just because we know how to do it here on Earth, we know it could be possible on Mars. We just need to do some technology development. If you look at how we do it here on Earth, to me the question is, can we actually fit within a mass? Because it's all about mass. This drill shown in the picture, it weighs around 100 kilograms and drills to 2 kilometers in literally 100 days. That's 2 kilometers. It's plenty for drilling in the South Pole and getting down to the lake. So all of a sudden, the plot thickens. Something that we've been using here on Earth, power and mass-wise, you could potentially put on the surface of Mars and poke a hole in the ground. And that's what we've been doing. What you see in a picture next to the U-Haul track is a drill. This drill is 4.5 meters long. It's 2 inches in diameter. When you go to Home Depot, you have a big drill, followed by a small drill bit. This is reverse. Our drill bit is actually slightly bigger than the rest of the drill. And everything that you need to drill, all the actuators, electronics, computers, Z-stages, everything is packaged in this slim tube. It's called a wire line because it's suspended by a wire. So now to go deeper, you do not have to bring additional drill pipes like folks in oil and gas do. You just unspool more of the wire. And your wire provides data and power down to the drill. So using this drilling system, we managed to drill 2 holes in gypsum. And by the way, there is gypsum on Mars. We drilled 13.5 and 10.5 meters holes. And the drill is 4.5, which means 3.3 times the length of the drill. The hole was 3 times the length of the drill itself. And the only thing we saw was the wires coming out of the hole. you didn't see the drill. Entire drill was below the surface. So with these kind of technologies, you could potentially drill down. We got a contract to work on the follow-up drilling system. It's called Watson. It's actually not, we decided to repackage everything. It's 4 meters long, around 100 kilograms, weighs around 1 kilowatt. And actually, you can place it on a Curiosity-sized rover. So what you see here is a rover with a drill right in the center that can deploy it, and you can poke a hole down and get down to the ocean. We're gonna go to Greenland and next year and drill 100 meters as a demonstration that something like this could potentially be possible. Let's switch gears and talk about pure ice. And before I start telling you how to do this, let's go back a decade. In 2008, Mars Phoenix landed on the surface of Mars. It had a scoop and a drill bit to capture icy soil and ice. This is the first time in human history we touched ice on the surface of Mars. And we found that ice is salty, it's got the perchlorates. But we did this. The mission lasted for just over 100 days. It was a groundbreaking mission. If you look at the picture on the bottom left, what you see these patches, that's pure ice. That's pure ice, literally pure, few inches below the surface. Mars Phoenix landed up north. During winter, this area is covered by 10 feet of carbon dioxide snow. So obviously going there is going to be really tough and surviving in the winter. That's why going further south makes sense. And also, just recently, again, we found glaciers. There are literally glaciers, 100-meter deep glaciers below a couple of feet of regolith. And they're not 60, 70 north. They're somewhere around 35 north. So they're in a location where actually you can go and make a settlement. And the primary location would be Arcadia Planitia on the left-hand side. We found craters. These craters have shown exposed ice, so we know a few feet below the surface we have tens of feet, tens of meters of literally pure ice. These areas are relatively flat, so you can actually land there without worrying about hitting big rocks. Low latitude, which means you can rely on solar power. It's relatively warm, and it's also in a low elevation, which means you have a lot of atmosphere to slow you down because it's deeper down. So this Arcadia Planitia in particular is also a spot that SpaceX has been looking at for putting a first human settlement on the surface of Mars. And all the things that you're looking for, everything kind of works out. You have water, you have energy, it's pretty close, and you can launch humans back to Earth from this location. So how do you mine this kind of water? And again, to figure it out, we turn our attention to Antarctica. Previously, this is South Pole in Antarctica. For decades, the way these guys were getting water, they would go outside, they would shovel snow, they would melt the snow, and they would have a drinking water. And then this guy, Rodriguez, came up with an idea. How about drilling a hole, say 20, 30, 40 meters below ice, and warm up this cavity 10, 20, 40 meters below, and they pump the liquid water out to the surface. And this so-called Rodriguez well is right now, has been working for almost 20 years, is a primary source of liquid water in the South Pole. So what you see on the picture on the left-hand side is a pump. This pump essentially pumps warm water to the surface. Some of this water goes through a heat exchanger. It heats up into the steam. This steam goes back to the hull to heat up and then melt additional layers of ice. It's sort of like a fracking in the oil industry. You're pumping liquid down and then you're pumping oil up. It's a similar thing, all right, here, and it works. And as a side note, the temperature that this rod well is working at around -50, -60 centigrade is very similar to the temperature that we're going to see on the surface of Mars at exactly the same time. So when I saw all of this, I put a proposal together called Red Water. And this proposal got funded. The project is starting right now. But over the next couple of years, we are going to be developing technology that will make this water extraction feasible. What you see here is an athlete rover, and some of you may be familiar with this. with two critical technologies. The first one is called tubing. It's this tube that's on a drum right in the center. This called tubing is essentially a drill. The tube unspools, makes a rigid tubing, and goes below the surface. So it's sort of different from what oil and gas is doing with the drill pipes. Instead of having drill pipes, you have a tube that's continuous. At the bottom of this called tubing, you have so-called bottom hole assembly. And this is where all the magic happens. This has drill bit, this has pumps, this has heaters. This thing essentially goes down into the water, warms it up, liquefies it, and pumps it up to the surface. So something like this is feasible because it's being done here on Earth. This is called tubing. This is actually a system that's being deployed in outback Australia every single day. It weighs something like 15 tons. It drills 500 meters below the surface. It's got a drill is a tube. It's essentially a tube. It could be a steel tube. It could be made out of composite material. But at the end of the day, it's a tube that you can use to drill down and you can use to pump water to the surface. So if you know nothing about aerospace and you look at this drill rig, which doesn't look very big, it's 15 tons. It drills 500 meters at a meter a minute. So now, if your goal is to not go 500 meters, but to go, say, 10 or 20 meters, you can keep on scaling everything down. Substitute steel for very light titanium, and all of a sudden, something like this could weigh maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 tons. And the SpaceX BFR can put 100 tons on the surface of Mars. So things like rigs for ISRU can be absolutely feasible. We actually developed this kind of cold tubing as a drill. This drill weighs 1 kilogram and drills a couple of meters in a soil. Something that just weighs 1 kilogram is the size of a shoebox. What you see is a flat tape. It's a composite material, unspools, and this flat tape makes a tube. So you start with something tape and then becomes a tube. And on the right-hand side, it essentially unspools. So you can bring something that's really, really small that can penetrate literally meters below the surface. And this test was done under Mars conditions in this big Mars chamber, drilling 3 meters below the surface. And pretty soon you will see the cuttings or regolith being blown out of the hole with the compressed air at the speed of 2 meters in 2 minutes. You can see this, this powder coming out, making this beautiful cutting. So stuff like this works. Let's look at the ice-cemented ground. First question we ask: how strong is ice-cemented ground? And the folks that live on the East Coast in winter, they know it can be as strong and stronger than concrete. Us living in LA, we don't have the same baseline. So we did a bunch of tests. We did a bunch of tests, and we measured compressive strength on the y-axis versus density and water content. Bottom line is, icy soil is as strong or even stronger than concrete. So how do you dig into this thing? Well, we know that we use jackhammers to dig into concrete and break it up. So we thought, hey, how about using jackhammered percussive digger? So instead of having a jackhammer, you have a scoop and you're pounding it into the soil. We ran a couple of tests to see if it works. And here it's no percussion, and here it's with these percussions. And just visually, if you look at what's happening, you'll notice that if there's no percussion, you're pushing up this huge layer of soil, so your forces are really high. Whereas without percussion, because you're breaking up these layers, the amount of soil that you have to excavate is much lower, so the forces are much lower. We tried to do the same thing with a saturated icy soil, and this is the scoop with something like 4 or 5 joules per blow hammer that slowly is going to try to dig into this icy soil. And you'll see with something like 3,000 to 4,000 newtons of force, that's as deep as we could have went. That's it. That's all you can do in the icy soil. it just stops. In the same bin, we took a hammer drill, and we realized that actually with hammer drill you can drill down and then penetrate and capture, make a hole this way. So we decided to go back and develop a water extraction system that's based on a drilling system. It's a coring tube shown right over here that drills down, creates a core, and on the inside you heat up the core. So you don't have to bring the core to the surface. It stays in a subsurface, you heat it up, you volatilize water vapor, and this water vapor comes out and it's being captured on the cold trap right over here. We put the scoring system on a small rover. This is a resource prospector rover at NASA Johnson. That's our drill. This is our water extraction system. We drilled into limestone to see how it works. We drilled down to 50 centimeters in 10 minutes with like 120 watts of power. We also drilled in ice. This is our ice block in a freezer. We managed to get down to half a meter in literally a couple of minutes with 100 watts. So something like this is definitely possible. Let's look at quickly at hydrated minerals. The baseline is gypsum. It's got 2 water molecules. So now if you can mine this gypsum, heat it up, you can actually extract water this way. And something like this is done here on Earth. We mine gypsum for many uses. But the way it's being done is you drill blast holes, you put explosives, you have a lot of fun watching how this thing explodes. I'm not sure how many of you have seen huge explosions. It's just a lot of fun. You put it in a transport loader, you crush it, and then you go through calcination process. You essentially heat it up, you extract water, and you get the powder. And this powder is used for agriculture, for wallboard, and things like this. We realize it's going to be really tough to do this stuff on Mars, especially with explosives. So we developed another process. Essentially, this thing looks like a snail, but the idea is that you inject warm water into gypsum, you dissolve it in situ, so there's no drilling involved. You're essentially using this pressurized hot water to dissolve it, to break it up, and then you pump the slurry into a processing plant. And this is something that we're doing with Michigan Tech. This one shows breaking of gypsum underwater with water jetting. Breaks up very, very fast because gypsum is not super strong. And here is recapturing water through this sort of calcination process. So these kind of technologies could be used on Mars for gypsum. And then lastly, how about regolith? Regolith is pretty easy. You just have to mine it, you put it in a pressure cooker, you heat it up, and you extract water. And there has been a couple of ways to mine it. The first one is a razor. It's a pretty cool sort of bucket excavation system. It's got 2 buckets on either side. It was developed at NASA Kennedy. Just Tony right over here that was part of this. It has 2 drums on either side, so as it mines, these excavation forces are counteracted, so net zero forces. In the middle, you have sort of percussive sonic scoop, and then right at the bottom is a pneumatic mining system. It's something that we developed back in Berkeley over 20 years ago, working with Larry. So something like this, is a very high QOL and exists. So to conclude, without ISRE, there is literally no human exploration. There is many ways to do this, and there is a technology that's being developed right now to do this. And before I end, I want to point to the student competition run by NASA at Langley. Every year, there's something like 12 teams, student teams coming and competing for the prize, and they have to drill through regolith, drill into ice, and extract water. And whoever extracts more water wins. So it's a really, really good learning, learning process for myself. I'm looking at all these different ways that students can come up to mine the water. So with this, I'd like to thank you very, very much and open room for questions.
All right, any questions? I have 2 microphones on each side of the room.
You expect the water and the water ice to also contain perchlorates as some of the soil does, and does that cause any issues with either corrosion of the equipment or with the usability of the water mined for either drinkable water or rocket fuel or other things that you would have to distill it or do other things with it before you can use it?
It's a very good question. So we know there's evapochlorites in soil. We haven't found positive determination of perchlorates in ice because we didn't really capture pure ice and analyze just pure ice. We analyzed ice with soil, and we know soil has perchlorates. But there is a high probability that ice does have perchlorates because of these lakes that we discovered. They have to be super saline at -10 centigrade to -74. So very likely water or ice does contain perchlorates. And yes, one of the biggest problems is cleaning of water. Okay, one of the biggest problems is trying to clean it up, process it in such a way that your equipment is going to last for a given amount of water. Just a side note, NASA requires 16 tons of water. Okay? 16 tons of water. That's it's a sphere 3-meter diameter. It's not very much. SpaceX requires 100 tons of water. So that's 10 meters by 10 meters by 1 meter. For us, it's going to be 30 feet by 30 feet by 3 feet. It's not much, right? So you can just look at the technology that we have right now, do some changes to material type, but I'm pretty positive that when it comes to equipment, we should be able to do this kind of stuff because we do not have to mine millions of tons.
So how much energy do you need for your drilling machines? I believe it's going to be big. So where do you plan to get this energy?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So energy required to drill is a really small fraction of the energy required to essentially melt ice and pump it to the surface. Most of our drills are kept to run hundreds of watts. The motor is designed for up to 1 kilowatt. But when I saw BFR on the surface of Mars, and I was told that this thing can put 100 tons of mass and then we're gonna have literally these huge solar arrays rolled out to give us whatever power we need. I realized that the paradigm is changing. Okay, we should stop thinking MER curiosity. Things are changing. Thanks to BFR, what it can put on the surface of Mars, all of a sudden, drilling 10, 20, 50, 100 meters is feasible. Okay, I can put 10 kilowatts because I can put system that will generate this kind of power, and I can put motors big enough to do that.
Is the student competition open to international teams?
Currently, no. So it's not like a competition that Mars Society is running in Utah. Here you need to be associated with a U.S. university, and it's also on NASA Langley premises. But so like foreign nationals, they have to be escorted and so on, because that's some foreign nationals run part of this competition. But right now, no. But maybe in the future, this will change.
Okay, that will conclude. We got one last speaker.
Chris, what about biological contamination?
That would be really cool. It will make Guado's job much easier. So first thing we're gonna do is poke a hole, taste the water. Okay, we're gonna taste it. We're gonna find out what it is, how it tastes. We're gonna figure out how to clean it. Concerning probably your question is to do with planetary protection, I presume. Yes, that's a big question. Now, the Mars, if you go back to Mars Phoenix, it had to go through dry heat microbial reduction. So everything that went down to the surface, touched ice, had to be sterilized at 125 centigrade for 24 hours. The stuff that's gonna go below the surface will have to also be sterilized, okay? But the stuff that goes below the surface, it's not a lot of stuff, okay? It's not a lot of stuff. It's a drill that's a couple of inches diameter, a couple of meters long. And this part can be put in a sided bag, right? In a biobarrier, so-called. It could be opened up, and only this part will go below the surface and touch water. Everything that's above the surface doesn't touch water, so it doesn't have to be sterilized. It doesn't have to go through DHMR. And as a side note, some of the components that we developed for the so-called bottom hole assembly that goes into ice, electric motor, this stuff works at 500 centigrade. We actually developed it for Venus exploration. So we don't have to tip top at 125 C for sterilization. We can go all the way to like 300, 400, 500 C and kill everything that's on the surface.
Okay, this will conclude the questions here for the first Coming up next will be the first, it's a special panel we have. Oh, yes. John Mark is in the room. He may not have to go, but he'll be waiting for after the panel maybe. 9:30. No, right over there.
That's okay.
Okay, welcome. Getting close to the lunch hour, but we got a really great group here coming up. It's a panel, special panel called The First. We have Kelly Girardi, who's a aerospace and defense strategist who has been working on the Darwin NASA space systems and the Commercial State of Flights Federation 35. And also we have here with us is Bo Wilson.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's close to lunch, but I promise this is worth it. My name is Kelly Girardi, and I am a defense strategist. I've worked with DARPA, NASA Space Systems, Commercial Space Flight Federation, and I'm very excited today to introduce you to a special panel to talk about the upcoming Hulu series, The First. As you may already know, the show is set in the not-so-distant future and depicts the first human journey to Mars, focusing not only on the astronauts, but on their families and the ground crew back home on Earth. So joining me on stage today are writer and producer Beau Willimon, the creator of House of Cards, and the creator and executive producer of The First, and former JPL director and Caltech vice president, Dr. Charles Alachi, who serves as an expert advisor to The First, and award-winning director and actress Lisa Gay Hamilton, who joins an impressive cast in The First and plays one of the show's most experienced astronauts. So, before we jump into a discussion, Beau has graciously offered to share with us a first look at the series. And in this circle of trust, I'm going to ask that no one photographs or records any of the media that's shared with you on screen today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beau for a quick introduction to the series.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for supporting interplanetary exploration. It's a real honor to be on this stage and share a little bit of the work that we've been doing with you all. Certainly, conferences or Humans to Mars in DC or the international, or the IAC, these sort of events which we've relied heavily upon in order to do our research, help us create the most realistic speculation of what travel to Mars will look like in the near future. So we want to tell the human story of that exploration on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want to make sure that our science and our tech and all of the details are as accurate as they can possibly be, because in order to imagine what the future could look like, we need to root it in the reality of now. So we're going to show you about a 90-second teaser here to give you a little taste of the show. And then we also have a slideshow where we can quickly take you through, give you an idea of some of our hardware and some of the questions that we pose. And I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of discussion, not only about the technical side, but also really all the human considerations of that 2.5-year round trip journey to the fourth planet from the sun. So let's go ahead and play the clip.
Aurora. At that altitude, you touch it. Every color. Colors you've never seen before. Lights moving all around. The universe. And it's right there. I always think of Sagan's words. Every human being that ever was lived out their lives on a moon of dust, suspended in a sunbeam.
3, 2, 1.
Any time people venture into the unknown, there is a cost.
Excellent. So now we're going to pull up a slideshow that's going to show a first look at a couple of elements of the show that Bo can walk us through.
I'm just going to move over this laptop real quick. How do I? Yeah, we know how to get to Mars, but I'm not quite sure how to operate the slideshow. Okay, so I'm going to do this rather quickly, and then we can come back to slides as we get deeper into the conversation, which is just sort of paint a broad strokes picture of our world. This is a view of our rocket. You can see that we're basically taking a large rocket approach with boosters. This is something similar to the SLS. In our conception of the near future, so this is a launch in 2031. During that launch window, we're considering a private-public partnership. Our fictional company is called Vista. You can think of that as somewhat similar to a SpaceX or a Blue Origin. In our conception, the bulk of the money has come from the U.S. government, from NASA, but they have contracted a company like Vista really to carry out the nuts and bolts of the mission with government oversight. And we do actually get a little bit into the complexity of what that means when you have government oversight over the private sector in an effort to get to Mars. Here's an image of a launch. That's our Earth Ascent vehicle making its way to the Mars Transit Vehicle, the MTV. Our design mostly involves a hard inner core that then, so if you see that big cylinder to the right of the image, there's a hard inner core there that then has an inflatable portion. So you basically have a cylinder within a cylinder. We envisioned that there would be, say, about a half a dozen launches unmanned in order to get all these components into low Earth orbit. And those components, once assembled, would look like this. Meanwhile, we're also doing launches to Mars over the course of several years during different launch windows to send things like rovers, land rovers, helo rovers, satellites, also our Mars Ascent Vehicle, which will allow the astronauts to launch back from the surface of Mars up to the MTV that's in orbit on their way home. The MAV will be making its own fuel on Mars, drawing from the CO2 in the atmosphere and frozen water beneath the surface. We'll get more into all of the details of the landscape and geography of our base camp and where our landing site's going to be later on in the story. Really, our first season is about getting to the starting line, getting to that first launch, and much of it is here on Earth. But we do touch upon some of the elements that I'm talking about right now. So that main big cylinder is where the astronauts hang out. You'll have everything from their comms deck to the galley to storage to sleeping quarters, workout area. One thing we're debating right now is we're designing the build we're extending this set so we can see the full spaceship in seasons to come. Are things like, do we want to incorporate a sled that can go in circles within the outer shell to give the astronauts basically gravity time, like for an hour a day. Things like this, we have to consider what the human impact of travel to another planet is on the body. We know things like the deterioration of bone density. We know different physiological effects that radiation can have in theory over a long period of time. All these considerations are things that we have to think about when we're working with former astronauts, NASA and others, to make sure that we tackle these in an accurate way. So there you can see the MTV in orbit around Earth as the EAV is making its way there. Sorry, let me go back to this image for a second. In the middle, you can see the docking port. There's a little circle that the EAV will dock similar that a capsule would to ISS. On the other side of that will be your Mars lander capsules that once you get to Martian orbit, you can detach, go to the surface while the MTV hangs out for 18 months until you go back up and make your way back home during the next transit window. Where the solar panels are attached is really where all of your systems are located. You need plumbing, you need air filtering, CO2 scrubbers, all of your electronics, everything that makes the machine work. And then the final portion on the left-hand side of your screen is the engines. This is a pretty pragmatic approach. It's not about how it looks on the outside, it's about the function. I happen to think it looks rather beautiful, but we're not trying to make slick science fiction rockets here. We're trying to make something that has the most bang for the buck in terms of its payload and its capabilities. There's some images from the inside of the core when our astronauts are for the first long burn that takes them out of low Earth orbit into interplanetary space. Here's a concept image of what it would look like when our Mars lander is making its way just beginning into the Martian atmosphere on its way to the surface. That heat shield is an inflatable. We're really interested in this sort of carbon-based synthetic inflatable technology, which really allows you to expand upon the infrastructure in a way that is cost-effective, that is light, and that allows you to pack something like this in a very small space. Here, one of the things we touch upon in the show is the engineering side of it. So here you see a vacuum tube that we created on our set, where what they're trying to do is well, I won't get into all the details here, but there's a problem with the nav on the surface of Mars, which is jeopardizing the mission, and they need to try to fix it remotely. And one of the ways that they're going to have to do that is by using a rover to short circuit the power line between our small nuclear reactor on the surface of Mars, and the MAV, which has stopped speaking to the engineers back on Earth. So they're looking for creative ways to essentially reboot the computer. And one of those is to use the drill on one of the rovers to try to short circuit the power cord and essentially reboot the computer. And of course, before you do something like that, 50 million miles away or more, you want to test it a bunch on Earth. So we want to make sure that we're paying homage to the thousands of people on the engineering side that are making all of this possible on a distant planet. Some images from mission control. AR technology is something that we're investigating as being a normal component of the near future. So you'll see people with AR glasses who are able to, look at computer screens standing by the pool in the back of their house. And this becomes a much more interactive experience that's integrated into our daily lives. Here's our spacesuits. These were built by actual spacesuit manufacturers. We work closely with former astronauts who now are consulting on real-life spacesuit manufacturing. So these things are about as close to the real thing as you can get. And I'm proud to say that all of our astronauts that came to set and saw these suits in person thought they were pretty nifty and said, yeah, wow, I wish we had these when we were up in space. These are some images from our version of our rocket build facility. We're also looking at things that house technology different here on the ground on Earth. I mentioned AR glasses. We're looking at self-driving cars, electric cars, what they might look like 13 years from now. So they're not crazy Back to the Future hovercrafts. They're still cars, but they look a little more futuristic than what we have now. That's the concept design. Here you see an actual car in a still frame from the show. I'll go really quickly through this, but when you're designing things like AR glasses that will be as ubiquitous as iPhones are now, you really have to design it down to the tiniest little detail. So this is early stages of us asking ourselves in a Steve Jobs sort of way, what do these glasses look like? And so each of these components here actually relate to real technology. Everything from bone conduction devices that are taking the sound directly into your skull so you don't need an earplug, to a power source, and also the aesthetic beauty of the thing. This world creation is something that was really important to us, so we didn't feel like we were just sort of like, and now you have magical glasses that can make you see computer screens floating in front of you. We really wanted to think through how would that happen. We're looking at all sorts of different ways that communication will be different 13 years from now, from earbuds and charging devices that you carry with you to bracelets to kits basically that are customized for what you want your communications experience to be. And of course, these elements will make their way up into the spacecraft. You can imagine, I was talking to Chris Hadfield about this on Friday actually. You can imagine that if you're on the bike, which is something you have to do 2 hours a day on your way to Mars, that you could just be staring at, a storage package in front of you, or you could have your AR glasses on that will allow you to bicycle through Central Park if you want, so that, it's sort of like the 2031 version of the holodeck on Star Trek, which is, maybe not, we can time travel back to like the Wild West, but I can have immersive experiences that help from a morale standpoint deal with the isolation of being in space in a confined environment where I don't have access to the things that make me feel human. There's an example of Sean Penn wearing some of these glasses in the first episode. And I think that's it so that's the quick slideshow there. Now we'll jump into a conversation about, the making of the show and the questions that we posed and what we found along the way.
So the first question I have is for you, Bo. In creating this series, is space exploration something that's been a personal passion of yours or a topic you always wanted to write about? Or were there specific themes about a human journey to Mars that you found specifically compelling?
Well, personally, I've always been drawn to science, which has also led me to space. I mean, I thought early on I was going to be a physicist, actually. That's what I was studying in college. until I discovered the hard way that my math wasn't strong enough. So rather than having to make all the numbers add up and there being a right solution, I went to the land of make-believe where you can kind of make up your own math. And then now I found my way back where I'm like, well, I've got to be right on the math again in order to create the most realistic story. But I'm also I've always been drawn to stories of, like I'm an adventure travel freak. Any story about, going to the ocean depths or about the first explorers making their way across the oceans, people crossing deserts, people climbing mountains. To me, that's an ancient story. There's an incessant, almost irrational need in us to know what's on the other side of the horizon. That goes back to the very first cave people who, walked out of their cave and one of them said, I wonder what's on the other side of that ridge. And so I see Mars as the latest iteration of that need. It's one of the things that differentiates us as a species, is curiosity, is that need to try to understand. And so it's both a futuristic story, but I think also speaks to a much deeper and ancient story within us that sets us apart. And any story that pushes people to their limits, to ask, what am I capable of? That are people that are willing to fail or even place themselves in great peril along the way in order to see what their limits are, is something that I find inherently dramatic. Those are real life issues for anyone that's going to Mars. When you go from your training, I'm sure that you must be running up against your own limits all the time. And I also think that those sort of journeys where you ask yourself what your limits are can be as internal as they are external. So for instance, there's a character that is Sean Penn's fictional daughter on the show, who is an artist, and through her painting, she's trying to deal with her demons. I think her journey inward into the soul is just as vast and perilous as a journey to another planet in some ways. Looking at those comparisons, what are inward or spiritual journeys versus outward and scientific journeys, and seeing how similar they actually are, is an interesting way to approach a journey to Mars.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a journey to Mars, there's probably no one more uniquely qualified to advise on that than Charles. And I know, I'm sure almost everyone in this room is aware, but I think it bears repeating that during his tenure as center director, JPL landed 3 rovers on Mars, sent probes to the far reaches of space, and helped map our planetary neighbors for future robotic and human missions. So in consulting for a series like the first, what's important for you to get right? And when you see NASA depicted in film and television, are there any common misconceptions?
So let me, before I answer specifically that question, let me kind of expand on what you just asked. So the way I got involved, I was on vacation in Hawaii, and I got a phone call from a guy called Zach, who was one of Bo's assistants, and he said, well, Bo Woodman would like to talk with you about advising them for a Mars series that they are doing. So I thought, gee, that's another Hollywood guy who wants, to do another series. But I said, sure, I'll talk with him. So we chatted on the phone. I was pretty impressed with his idea, and then we made an appointment to get together for lunch at the Caltech Athenaeum. And as soon as we sat down, he started asking all these questions about Mars orbit electricity, windows for launching, speed of entry. And I said, wow, this guy is pretty smart. He really did his homework. So, I mean, even we could hire him at JPL. So going back to your first question about him, I was very impressed with how much both his passion about the movie, or the series, and then how much homework he has done. So at the end of the lunch, I'm sure I'll be glad to consult for you guys. But the key thing also, to answer now your question, he put a lot of emphasis that he really wanted the technical part to be very correct. He didn't want to do it as science fiction, another science fiction, kind of series. He insisted he wanted to make sure whatever design is done, whatever problems will happen, on Mars or in preparation for Mars and so on, are technically correct. Of course, it's a drama. It's not a documentary that is done. So there will be a lot of the human drama in it, which in actuality, that's the real work. When you are telling somebody you are going to leave your family for 2.5 years, that's pretty, there is a lot of drama which goes in there. And Bo is trying to depict that. The drama of going for the first time to Mars and what happened to the astronauts and their family, people on the ground, and also about the interaction with the politician, with Congress. How do you convince Congress to spend these billions of dollars this adventure. So that's particularly what impressed me about the series and what attracted me, to be involved in it is emphasis on making it as real as possible.
Absolutely. And Lisa Gay, you've had a prolific career across film, television, theater. You've worked with Bo before. What excited you the most about joining the cast of the first and working with Bo again to bring this story to life?
Probably the basic is a paycheck. That's the first thing.
Work is good.
The other is, just sitting here and listening to both speak about all the technical aspects of the show, even the personal, all of that intellectual and emotional capacity and interest is attractive to any actor who wants to be able to ideally dig deeply as the artist. I'm never going to be a physics. I'm terrible in math, so that was never my path. My path has always been storytelling. And so being able to be a part of a show that I think both, or someone I heard use, not science fiction, but science fact and science real. And that's something that I can actually, hold on to as an actor is what are the real and emotional aspects to this story that is far-reaching from anything that I've actually even imagined in real life. So to have the opportunity to think about space tangibly and Mars, that was out of my realm. So being able to research something that you've never researched before is always so wonderful as an artist because it just broadens your vision.
Absolutely. And you've obviously assembled a very high caliber group of advisors and consultants for the show. So how did you balance and strike this balance between scientific accuracy and then also creative freedom to imagine this near future?
Sure. Well, the science part sets up certain givens that you have to work within. So, in the same way that any story about humans has to take into account, like if you're telling a story that takes place in the winter, everyone's going to be wearing jackets, right? Like you start thinking of these given circumstances that then affect your story. So, there's certain hard givens on Mars. There's the physics of what it actually takes to get there. There's the fact that launch windows happen about every 26 months. There's the fact that it requires money, in order to do it. So you start saying, okay, these are certain things that dictate like hard and fast rules that I can't move away from. And then within that, you start to ask yourself the more human questions, like, and you start big and you move towards the specific, like what does it mean for a family member to say to another family member, at some point, I'm going to leave for 2.5 years. I mean, we know in human history, there's plenty of examples of this, people going away to war or Shackleton heading off to try to traverse Antarctica. But what does it specifically mean when you're talking about people who will be farther away from Earth than any human has been by powers of magnitude? When the risk assessment for this in terms of death is something that you can speculate on and have a lot of encounters try to place a percentage to, but because it's the first time, you can't completely know. What does that mean? I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the show is between Lisa Gay and her partner in the show. And her partner's been incredibly supportive of, we see different types of families, some that are a little more shaky than others, but this is incredibly supportive one. And yet, when they sort of come to the moment of truth, where there's the chances of there being a catastrophic failure on the way to Mars have increased due to some technical difficulties that they have not been able to completely overcome, all the astronauts have to go back to their families and ask again, okay, given this increased chance of failure, of death, how do you feel about this? And we see her wife actually, be the supportive person she's always been, and yet she's really struggling, and there's a cost to it. And what does it mean to support your partner in doing something that will change humankind forever and make history in a profound way, and yet the potential cost of that is losing someone you love. Placing that in the context of the science, I think, is what makes it feel real.
Absolutely. And having watched a few episodes, I can say what strikes me the most about the show so far is it's not a sci-fi show set in some alternate future. really is just a gripping drama set pretty soon from now. And, going back to something, Charles, that you mentioned earlier, we're on our way. As you all know in this room, the human journey to Mars has started, and it starts here on Earth, and largely thanks to folks like Charles himself who have dedicated careers to laying that foundation. But when it gets closer to us actually achieving this, it starts to feel like we're facing more of an economic challenge than an engineering challenge. And so what you mentioned before about convincing politicians, in your experience and in this current budget environment, how would you begin to convince politicians that an investment in science and exploration is essential?
Yeah, I think, as you said, I mean, we live in a political world, so we have to accept that. And it's very critical for people like you, your society, your individuals, to keep communicating to the politician that this is important. This is important for the future of our country. So one example I always use with them is look what happened during the Apollo days. I mean, I grew up during the time. I mean, I was in college when the Apollo landing, took place, and it was fascinating. And it led to a lot of people being excited about exploration, science, technology, and even being engineers. But it created this environment in our country of we can do great things, and we can take risks, we can be adventurous and do great things. And that embedded everywhere in our society at that time. And that became a key factor in our economic well-being. So I always, when I talk with a politician, you have to be prepared to what we call the elevator speech. You get only 1 minute, of time, and you need to get them the message in 1 minute. In getting to be able to tell them that story. And fortunately, I think there are a number of politicians who are excited about space. I mean, I know one person in particular by the name of John Culbertson, who's happened to be the chairman of the Appropriation Committee for NASA. He is absolutely fascinated with space exploration. So you need to nurture a couple of key politicians who are in the right position to become the advocates of doing that. And I almost found almost all of them, well, none of them is a scientist, but all of them who are excited had some class in astronomy or planetary science when they were in college. And they were fascinated, by it. So that's the kind of thing that we decided for them. And as I said, after all, they are your representatives, they are my representatives. So by advocating to them that this is important, to do, I think that's how we get that message.
It's certainly one of our goals of the show. Every story that's told about what travel to Mars could look like is another drop in the bucket in terms of sort of increasing public awareness and public will for a mission of this. Political power comes from popular will. So we're hoping in our own small way that by dramatizing the story in a real way, will increase the appetite around the world for something like this.
Yeah, it's a good lesson for us as an industry too, to be mindful of, as we get closer to not operating in an echo chamber, and to really make sure we're bringing politicians and the public into the fold and having real buy-in on what this means for us as a species. And Lisa Gay, you play one of the most experienced astronauts on the show, and I'm so curious how you began to prepare for that role and get in that mission-focused mindset.
We were given tons of research to read, things like that. But for me, it was always tangible when I can actually speak to a human being, as Bo obviously did, with experience and knowledge. It was something that I knew nothing else. So I think honored being able to speak with Jeanette Epps, who was meant to go up to the space station. And it was a wonderful conversation with her about what it was like for her as a woman of color, to be a part of that institution. And obviously there is the technical aspect of learning about anything and everything that you have to know about to be prepared to go to space, to go to the space station. But there's also that emotional cost. As Bo was speaking about, what is it like to take a job that actually is dangerous, and that is life and death. And if I understand correctly, one of the greatest challenges is the takeoff, right? And landing. Those are the two most dangerous parts of the mission. And so I was able to ask Jeanette about the idea of how she felt about death and leaving family. And it was wonderful to hear her perspective about, what I've chosen to do is to spend as much quality time with each person in my family that I love, let them know that I love them. And then she said, I'm good to go. I really can accept whatever comes next because I believe so strongly in this mission. that sense of commitment and love to being able to die for something that you believe in, as King suggested, really solidified for me the idea of risk sort of leaves you for some strange reason. And you just are so focused on what can happen here, what are the greater possibilities, and being able to say, I'm okay in pushing that movement forward because I believe in it so much. That kind of gave me something to hold on to.
I just want to add that there's also a great deal of physical endurance required to play these roles. I mean, folks like Kelly or the former astronauts that we've spoken to spend years training before their first mission. And we're throwing people into spacesuits that are pretty realistic, that are stiff, that are hot. You know, we didn't necessarily have all the fans going, stuff like that, and you know, and trying to make your way over to craft services and these things.
He's feeling really nice because after 2 minutes in the spacesuit, laying down, like, no, cut, not working, can't breathe. I mean, like 2 minutes, all of us were in a panic. I really had to adjust.
Yeah, but even for instance, like there's a common thing that happens among astronauts sometimes is they're getting used to spacesuits, a claustrophobia that happens that can lead to sickness, you know, and so like, yeah, we have that real life thing happening. I mean, I won't name names, it wasn't this day, but day one in the spacesuit, someone puked in their suit, you know, from the claustrophobia, and our EAV which is like a pretty realistic looking capsule, you know, that we built to specs and everything was on a hydraulic set of hydraulic motors to simulate the shaking of takeoff. So, you know, these poor actors are spending 12 hours strapped in these seats in these spacesuits, and then we're turning the thing up. They don't do just one launch; they have to do like 20 of them. And this thing's shaking, and they're in this hot thing, and they can't hear the director very well because they got their helmets on. I mean, the physical toll was pretty extraordinary. And then we did some microgravity scenes as well, where, you know, obviously we don't have microgravity here on Earth, and you have to simulate it. So, you know, we had pretty advanced harnesses, which, you know, are similar to some of the harnesses that the NASA astronauts will actually use to simulate movement in a mock-up of ISS. And so, you know, these harnesses can rotate on 3 axes, and they're attached to it by cords to a track that allows them to move through the vessel. To learn how to move and operate in these things and make it look like you're in zero gravity is really hard to do. It took about 20 to 30 hours of training per actor just to be able to simulate that. So, you know, while they're in some ways very different engineering challenges than the engineers going to the real Mars will face, we had our own engineering challenges, and the actors were on the front lines of that, where the engineering hit the human, and their commitment to the training and to being able to simulate this stuff in a believable way was really extraordinary. And one more example I'll add of that is, you know, oftentimes astronauts, I'd be curious to know if you've done this aspect of training yet. They'll do something like a NOLS course. Or basically an outdoor extreme team building and physical endurance type of training. Our show is set in New Orleans for a whole host of reasons. So our NOLS type training that we see the astronauts going through is taking place in the swamps. And these were real swamps, you know, with real crocodiles and real toxic water. And Lisa Gay and others are, you know, pulling sleds full of equipment, you know, through these swamps. Like it's real. Like what we're filming there is not CGI. They're actually taking themselves through the really sort of almost bone crushing type of training that is required to get one's body and more importantly one's mind in shape. And they threw themselves into it. So they didn't have the years of training. They just had their commitment to the craft. Yeah. So.
What was the most challenging part, or physically challenging part of the training for you, or mentally?
The first day of the halter training for the anti-gravity, and literally after one spin, I'm like, take me out. Nurse had to be brought in. I had to take a Dramamine. I had to lay down, and they all assured me that after you do that once, so this trip the next time is better. But I thought to myself, "Oh, I'm gonna get fired." Because I was never able to do this
One of the big challenges we're going to face moving forward is once you get to the surface of Mars, of course, it's 1/3 gravity. It's actually a lot easier to simulate on screen zero or microgravity than 1/3. I can have someone floating through a vessel and hanging out those cords. But on Mars, how do I get someone to sort of do their sort of skip, hop, jump along the way of the surface? It would be a lot easier if I just had them floating in a lot of ways using green screen. But if we go to Jordan, Morocco, and are filming on the surface, how do I actually do that? So we're trying to figure that stuff out now. Like one example is we might have like an ATV that has a crane, and from that crane are some bungee cords that would be attached to someone in one of these spacesuits. And as they're sort of moving along, the bungees are helping create 1/3 gravity. So that would be how you handle just moving along the surface. That's technically difficult from a filming perspective, but also, if I have this glass of water and I drop it, it's actually easier to make it float than it is to make it fall at 1/3 speed. I can't just slow down the frame rate or speed up the frame rate to like 30 frames per second, because I can slow that falling down the frame rate, but then my astronauts would be talking at speed. So, it's interesting that in order to simulate Journey to Mars, you face a whole lot of kind of like engineering challenges on the film side.
I might be adding to both because that illustrates how much you want it to be real. On Friday, we had a brainstorming session. We spent the whole day. Bo and a couple of his people, and Adam Stetson from JPL was a chief engineer. And the key thing you want to figure out is how do you handle the time delay, in the communication. In many of the video and the movies and so on, people are talking to each other on Mars and on the ground, but that's not real. So he's really thinking about how is he going to create the environment and the discussion and the communication when you have a 10-minute, or 12-minute delay. So that illustrates how much he's putting emphasis on realism.
We had a really fascinating discussion too about landing site, which, it's funny because we're talking about places like Jezero Crater or Northeast Strinus, like in this room at Caltech, but NASA for real is going to be having a conference like a month from now to talk about this for the 2020 mission. And then we're like, well, if we did something, let's say that results in we're sending the 2020 mission to Jezero Crater, that we could, in our story, if we put our landing site close to there, actually go and our astronauts in our fictional story can go and find the real rover that was sent in 2020 that happens to be, just sitting there at the edge of the crater.
And to add to it, again, as long as we are in that, he decided he wanted to have some of the staff go to the actual meeting where the decision would be made. So you can see how the scientists debate and what's the rationale of picking that.
No, it's amazing. And, when we think about what we ask of our astronauts, it's surprising that they're not more household names today, especially considering how exciting this is going to be in the future. And I'm curious for your perspective on this because the public reception to the Mars rover program was pretty extraordinary. I mean, Curiosity is a celebrity in its own right. And so what do you think we could expect in terms of public global engagement when we actually land humans on Mars?
I mean, I was fortunate, as you mentioned, I was a director of JPL when we landed Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity. And a couple of things kind of really impressed me, which would reflect on what. Number one is how many people were engaged, particularly in Curiosity. I mean, we literally had 1.6 billion hits on our website the day after we landed, from all around the world. The other one, which always stick in my mind, that when we were doing Spirit and Opportunity, particularly when Spirit was having some problems, I got this email from a poet in Scotland. And it was a poem where he was saying that every morning he gets up and see what's happening to Spirit, his body, Spirit. And this is for robots, that you get that excited. So I could imagine when we land a human, or through basically the drama of sending a human and landing. I think that's going to be something which probably we haven't seen in centuries of doing that. The excitement of the public and particularly the young people and the older people like me. Hopefully I still will be around when that will happen. So I absolutely would envision that's going to be a completely century-changing event that will happen when we land humans on Mars.
Yeah, it could be, the single biggest achievement of our species. It's almost a bookend as we as Earthlings. And then the next chapter is we've unlocked interplanetary travel. And so considering what an important feat that is, not just for the US or individuals, but for the entire world. One of the things that I found most encouraging in the series is the level of diversity that's depicted in the show. The cast, the crew, the employees at NASA, the employees at Vista. I mean, that's a company I would want to work for. And I have to say, though, that is one area where I'm so grateful that you took creative liberty to imagine the future, because that has not necessarily been my experience in this industry to date. And yeah, it's true. We are making strides. We absolutely are making strides, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. But I've worked in the Mojave Desert at rocket companies where I'm the only woman full-time at the company with, working on Mars landing technologies. And I've worked on many more teams where I am the only woman on that team. So it is very validating to see this level of diversity. And I've also watched enough film and television to know that that doesn't happen by accident. So I know that was a conscious decision, and I'm curious from you, why was representation so important to you to depict the show?
Well, if you're going to tell the human story, then you got to tell a story about humans. And humans exist in a world that is complex, that has a political and cultural landscape that we felt was important to not just reflect but also investigate. NASA, to its credit, has made, I think, a lot of strides in terms of diversity of the astronaut corps, but it also is still struggling at times, and you can look at beyond NASA, really to any industry for that matter, and say, okay, we're very much in a cultural moment now where we're thinking about these things in a way that these are issues that our world has been dealing with for centuries. But they're much more front and center in the conversation. And if your job as an artist is to reflect the world, the change happens sometimes rather quickly, but on the whole, things are culturally a lot more gradual. And to think that 13 years from now we won't be confronting a lot of the same dilemmas, problems, having the same conversations that we're having now, I think would be naive, or overly optimistic. That said, you have the opportunity in telling the stories set in the near future to see progress, to see change in ways that I think could be realistic. And yet at the same time, without giving too much of the story away, I mean, we are addressing issues of race and gender head on, not just in terms of representation, but in terms of the story itself. I don't think you can divorce these things from a human mission to Mars. The people who go are going to be representing an entire species. They'll be representing, 8 to 9 billion people. Those 8 to 9 billion people are incredibly diverse, and if you don't have a true representation as best as you can with 5 people of the diversity of our species, then really are you sending all of humankind to Mars, or are you sending a subset? And so I think these discussions will be a big part of crew selection, and also the meaning, the impact it will have on all of us will be directly tied to these people, their personalities, their backgrounds, their perspectives, and who they speak to. So yes, we're all humans, but we're also a lot of different types of humans with different backgrounds and perspectives, and I don't think you can just sort of skate past that. And so I felt, and the writers felt, and everyone we talked to felt that it was really important to engage with that.
It's aspiration.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that that's wonderful, and the idea that space in many ways is only for certain kinds of people, that it doesn't reach all the public schools that are here. So I think what our show also does is give everyone the opportunity to be included. So I think in terms of our publicity and how we do reach out, it's to all sorts of populations that should be watching the show, not that y'all are Mars groupies, but not not just folks who are interested in Mars, right? But everyone. So whether you're gay, whether you're a Catholic, whether you're straight, I mean, it really does afford everyone, all the population, to really watch the show. So that's I'm looking forward to and hoping for, especially since I played a queer Black female astronaut, that it really does open the world for a lot of people to watch the show, so we can have a lot more seasons.
Let me tell you a human story, which I think is going to kind of reflect on this. A few years ago, I asked a young employee at JPL, I told him, how did you become an engineer? He said, well, when I was in high school, I had no idea what I'm going to be doing when I grow up. And one day I was in the cafeteria and I watched this TV program, and it was these airbags which were bouncing on the surface of Mars. So I sat down and looked at it, turned out the landing of opportunity. And she said, I was so fascinated by it. I said to myself, I want to be part of that. So she changed her thinking, went to college, and now she's a driver on opportunity. The things she saw, landing on Mars, now she's one of the drivers. So I could envision this. Millions of people are going to be watching this program. They are going to, particularly the young people.
Yeah.
We want to be part of that.
And sometimes it's hard to be what you can't see. So seeing representation on screen and seeing yourself reflected back in these amazing careers and achievements can be very validating. So I think that's an amazing story. And on a similar thread to sort of challenging the status quo, there was a TED Talk of yours that I loved, where you had such a great quote just saying that it's so important to be bold and to keep pushing the limits. And so I'm curious to hear from you, where do you think we can afford to be bolder in space exploration? And in the next 10, 20, 50 years, where would you like to see the limits pushed?
Well, I mean, no question. First, every exploration requires more people, to do that. Because by definition, exploration meaning you are doing something for the first time,
right?
And therefore you are pushing the limit. And so I could envision that, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, traveling to Mars will become a little bit more of a routine. I mean, not routine in the sense I just go to LAX and fly to Mars. It would be a little bit more complicated than that. But it could be very much like what we have the station in Antarctica, where you have a group of people which actually go there. Some of them spend the winter, in Antarctica, so 6 months. This will be a little bit longer. But when I talk to scientists, colleagues at Caltech, they don't think about it. They think that that's normal. That's part of their exploration, is to go and do these kind of things. So I could envision 20 years from now that you have people which would go and do that as part of their exploration.
And one follow-up question to that, as we look at sort of this near future and something that first depicted so well and realistically is this public-private partnership. And in many ways, it's the best of both worlds. You have the deep institutional knowledge of NASA, and then you have the agility and the operational tempo of private industry. How do you envision that partnership continuing or expanding as we expand our footprint in the solar system? Where would you like to see that?
Yeah, no, I think really there are three parties for that kind of partnership. Clearly, there is the government, and particularly for major endeavor like exploring Mars. And I mean, you need the government resource, but think of it, the government is you. The government is not some other entity sitting there.
Right.
Then you have the commercial sector, and advances in technology now enabled a lot of companies, to be involved and to be part of it. And as you said, they move on a different tempo than the government, for good reason. I mean, the government is using taxpayer money; they have to be a little bit careful. Commercial sector tend to be a little bit more aggressive, because it's not taxpayers' money. And then there is the public, you and I, where you really are a key player. They have to be part of it. And I can see that combination of three elements is going to make this happen. And going back on, 20 years from now, when this has become real, I think people will look back at this program and you say, this program really got started, at least in the public mind. That this is something that we should be doing and we should be endeavoring.
Just to get into the public-private a little bit, and we're not going to do Q&A, but let's see, Mr. Zubrin's here, and so you have thoughts about this, I'm sure. We sort of looked at the full spectrum from the lean and mean Zubrin model, to a purely NASA mission that's many more years, many more missions, many more steps in the making. So, you can look at just on the money side, say from a 20 billion to a 500+ billion spectrum. And we envision something more in the middle. We put our price tag more around 75 billion in the near future. And that was looking at how do we minimize the number of missions, both for assembly in low Earth orbit and missions to sending hardware in advance to Mars. The truth of the matter is that the private sector, I really don't, and look, we could be totally wrong about this, and there's a lot of healthy debates, but it's hard to envision the private sector doing this entirely on its own, given the cost. I mean, if the cost even of one mission to send humans there and back was, say, $30 billion, that's a lot of Teslas to sell. And if you're looking at sustaining the amount of cash that's required to get there over multiple missions, that's really the sort of money that only governments have. Also, I don't think you can completely divorce national security concerns, the fact that government still controls airspace, that once you're looking at a mission to Mars, becoming more and more of a reality, it's tough to envision government not wanting to slap a flag on the side
I know, we're right about time.
Right, that's right. So we're just about done here. But I think that, we basically said, what is the middle ground here in which we can believably see how the private sector would interact with the US government so that we bring that price tag down, accelerate the speed at which we're able to get to Mars. And I think we did a fairly realistic job of that. We'll see in the near future whether we were right or not. But I think it's the most exciting way to think about in a pragmatic approach, how we actually get there in the next decade or two.
So we're getting a very subtle warning that we're at time. So please join me in a round of applause. The first will premiere on Hulu on September 14th. That's Friday, September 14th. Give it a watch. Spread the word. Thank you so much.
If you want to know what I think of it, I like it. And here's a book that maybe you can make some use of. All right. Thanks. And what I especially like about it, by the way, is the modest spaceship, not avoiding the Battlestar Galactica, because making the spaceship look like something that we can actually build is what will convince people that this is something we can actually do. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is going to be John Menkins. Is he here? Because he was just here. Well, I mean, elusive guy. Sure, go ahead. John Menkins, please. You missed the first time. Okay. He was sitting right over there. John Menkins. Wow.
Robert, he told me it was too late. He wasn't going to speak.
Okay, well, then, there you go. So, in that case, it's time to conclude the conference. I think this was a great conference. What do you think? If you hear or not. What? We've already asked. Okay, so I'm sorry. 2 strikes and you're out. Okay, so yeah, I think so too. And so here we are. We're at a time of great opportunity. The space revolution has been unleashed in the private sector. Public sector, John Cassani's organization, JPL, has now revealed The real Mars, Mars with glaciers on it, with they've already detected enough water there to match 10% of the Earth's fresh water supply, underground lakes, possibilities of extant life, definitely the possibility of future life. So let's make that happen. See you all next year. Next year, probably California.
I'm not gonna have lunch actually, so I'm just not gonna.
We'll see you guys. Take care.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
real
we'll see
fun.
you,
Yeah.
see you at the half.
Yeah, you know, yeah. They're not coming.
The sites. Case kind of.
I know, we kind of rotate our ERDT team, you know, like, you know.
It's kind of spelled.
So that means I do all the
Hey,
walking.
hey, hey.
No, we'll work. We'll split.
See you guys later.
Yeah, so
Keep
you're
in
gonna
touch.
wanna get lunch before you go back? Yeah, all right, so that's fine. Yeah.
See you, University.
You're out on Is this full video going to be, we won't have this on the internet until after the series premieres, right?
Probably not on the series, but the Mars Society.
Okay. This probably may or may not, may never.
May not be mentioned.
May never until after the event.
Yeah. Must be. Otherwise,
Okay.
Yeah. So now we're
good luck to everybody.
Right. Do submissions. And then land
Now, is the lead playing in Moscow?
Pretty well. So, look, and then start breaking it in.
My extension is over too. Should be.
So you're more into some of the data
And my is our other dog's name is Struggle.
Either what? Oh. Hey. Sorry.
We can turn this back.
at your window, absolutely limited to you guys no, we were not streaming. That was streaming though. That's the school that green tape on top there. That's nice.
Are they with the AV crew? You know? Okay, because I was, I think I saw him a while ago, but he's out for taking a break after the conference.
Yeah, I think so.
Did you capture the whole event, or did you? Really?
We're
On,
also just the only.
But are we posting it to YouTube?
I believe it's getting posted. I'm not sure.
Were you guys, or was he doing it on YouTube? Probably.
I think he's streaming to YouTube.
Because I was watching on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Good.
we filmed everything. We're gonna give it to James to edit. I'm not sure.
Who's James?
He's the guy with all the VR stuff. He's the guy with all the VR stuff.
Actually, a partner had set up some cameras for CDs, and he's been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
But being that he was just on the way, he saw that.
Yeah.
You guys, yeah, it was hard. And our normal guy is usually here, but he was at the burner.
Yeah, that's what he was saying.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, can I leave a number?
Yeah.
What I'd like to do, if we could, we still want to
right,
and we can certainly download them off YouTube, but you don't want that.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Our server is always it's set up anyway, but we're in the way. Which means I broke my ankle, and so I was a little late trying to get here. What's your name?
One of my daughters went to Berkeley bioengineering.
And
Done a lot
this
of
is actually not some video
work with
I'm actually I just shared it with this can tokenize individuals or groups or whatever have their own coin and share their reward online. And within a few clicks of the mouse, within 5 minutes, you got blockchain, everything with hundreds of thousands. You could have your own coin with your nation, with your coin, or whatever.
Yeah.
And NASGO is the main blockchain, but then fair enough, even let's people get on it by invitation only right now, because it hasn't launched yet. But last night, I thought, I did give Bob a there was a homemade card. But last night, Eric Pitt, the co-founder of this concept, was excited because he tweeted out that he just funded a SpaceX project in New Mexico. And I was the first one to respond. I was the first one to retweet it. And it's really, really cool. Way before but it's not a speculative thing. It's not a currency game. It's where companies and people have something to offer for their token, and then they can trade it online. And they're opening a social network in about a week called Nico. So they'll even help promote whatever you're doing. So it is really something. These guys have been working on it for a long time. But yeah, okay, Mason.
You feel better?
Yeah, I'll make it. You bet. Thanks.
I feel this guy's talking about the same stuff. So you got to engineer yourself and deal with it. It should show up. It's been, I know the videos from it. Okay, Tim. Yeah, good fun. I enjoy it. I always enjoy the experience of people getting close to all that. Okay. The nuclear stuff.
And the name of revenue is my end. Okay. When I call, thanks so much.
Plug in here again. Did the story she did? Yeah, and then there's Michelle Nichols in one of our conferences back here in LA in 1990. She said, I was at a party on the end of the second, the first year, the original Star Trek series was the first or second year. And they were all ready to have blue ratings, shut it down. No, that's not what it was. That's not what it was. She said she was worried about it. She knew it. And so she was at a here it is. And so she was after and she said, me? And she went over and talked to him, and he was from Atlanta, right? And he's sitting there. Holy show that I'm going to watch. Top that. Yeah. Don't quit. Boy. You did the famous kiss with Michelle Nichols. They did a